silence as dominance. Every negotiation, every argument, every conversation has a moment where one person stops talking and the other person cracks. They fill the void. They apologize for things they didn't do. They hand over ground they swore they'd hold. And the silent one, the one who said nothing, just won. The Romans knew it. Kings depended on it. That weight pressing down in a pause, that animal need to break it, to say something, anything, to feel less exposed. You've probably felt it without naming it. Silence isn't empty or weakness pretending to be quiet. It's the opposite. When you speak, you're a target. You're offering up a version of yourself for judgment. When you stay quiet, you stay intact. You become a blank screen. The other person projects their own story onto you. Authority, knowing something they don't, confidence they can't quite read, a boss who listens without flinching, a partner who doesn't defend themselves, a negotiator who just lets you talk until you've argued yourself straight into their corner. Here's the mechanic. This has nothing to do with real dominance and everything to do with comfort. Most people experience silence as a debt they need to pay. They feel responsible for filling it. But silence only feels awkward if you've agreed it should. That agreement is the whole game. Master it, and you stop performing. You stop oversharing out of nervousness. You stop explaining yourself before anyone asked you to. You become the one still thinking while everyone else is still trying to sound smart. It's the oldest move on the board, and it works because we haven't actually changed in 3,000 years. The unblinking pause. The moment someone lands something sharp, your nervous system lights up. Defend, explain, soften, fill the silence with anything. The Romans watched this happen and called it the pause, not because they loved drama, but because they'd seen how chaos erupts the second someone refuses to break it. When you stay absolutely still and say nothing, the other person's brain does all the work for you. It scrambles to interpret the void. It manufactures anxiety in the gaps. It invents worst-case scenarios before you've opened your mouth. And somewhere in that scramble, their original position often crumbles on its own. Think about a text you sent that got a long response, then radio silence. You spiraled, didn't you? You invented meaning in that pause. The silence had teeth precisely because it refused to yield. Modern power brokers understand this bone deep. The poker face across a negotiation table, the reporter's breath before answering a trap question, the person who doesn't react to an accusation but simply locks in eye contact and stays. What actually works isn't coldness, it's that you've stopped dancing to their rhythm. You're not performing urgency or self-protection. You're just there, steady, which somehow makes the other person feel more exposed than if you'd fought back hard. The dynamic flips without a word. Next time someone pushes, try breathing into it instead of filling it. Stay quiet, stay still, let them sit alone with what they just said. Watch what emerges when the pressure's off you and fully on them. Speak last in council. There's a moment in every meeting where the temperature shifts. When someone says the thing everyone was thinking but nobody said out loud. It lands differently because it arrives after the noise has settled. The ancients knew this. In councils across Rome, Egypt, and Greece, the wisest person often waited. They watched the room breathe first, caught the energy, saw which ideas were already dying on the vine. Then they spoke. What made them powerful wasn't the words themselves. It was that they got to respond to the actual conversation, not imagine it. You felt this too. Someone jumps in early with an idea and everyone else is now either defending it or pushing back against it. The conversation becomes a debate about their point instead of an exploration of the real problem. But the person who listens through the whole thing, they see the contradictions. They notice what nobody asked. They can point at the unspoken worry and name it. In a meeting, in a text thread, at a dinner table, silence before speaking is not weakness. It's information gathering. It's the difference between guessing what people need and actually knowing. The trap is that our culture rewards the quick take, the hot take, the person who speaks first and loudest. But that reward is shallow. What lasts is influence, and influence lives in the space where you understand the room better than anyone else in it. Try it once. Say less, listen longer, speak when you have something the group actually needs to hear. Watch what happens to the weight of your words. The last word trap. You're mid-argument and your mind screams, if I don't respond now, they win. So you add one more sentence, then another, even though the conversation is already dead. 3,000 years ago, Roman generals used silence as a weapon in negotiation. They would sit and wait, let the other side fill the void, pile justification onto justification until they had talked themselves into a corner. The person who speaks last often thinks they've won. They haven't. They've confessed. Kings and emperors understood that the compulsion to have the last word is a psychological leak, a tell that broadcasts desperation rather than strength. Modern you feels this same pull almost every day. A text thread where you add just one more thing. A meeting where you can't leave the room without the final comment. A family dinner where you circle back to prove a point nobody was still debating. Here's what actually happens. That last word becomes the only thing people remember, but not the way you intended. Instead of your logic, they recall that you needed to win more than you needed to listen. They notice the slight tremor under your words, the grasping quality underneath. The best negotiators, therapists, and leaders know this ancient move by heart. The power lies in stopping. Close the loop with quiet. Let them sit with what was said while you stay still, not scrambling to protect yourself or adjust the narrative. It's a small discipline that rewires how people read you entirely, less as someone fighting for dominance, more as someone sure enough to hold their ground without noise. Spartan brevity as threat. King Philip of Macedon sent the Spartans a threat. If I invade Laconia, I will raze your city to the ground. The Ephors wrote back one word, if. Not defiance wrapped in poetry, not anger dressed in rhetoric, just a single syllable that meant we will make you regret that conditional. The silence around it did more work than any roaring speech could have done. Your phone buzzes again, another text from someone trying to convince you of something, then another and another. Each one a small panic button, each message proof they don't trust their first version to land. Watch what happens when someone stops explaining. Your brain starts writing the script for them. Silence becomes a screen for your own fears. You assume the worst. You fill the void because the void makes you uncomfortable. That's the Spartan move. Not the words, but the refusal to soothe you with more of them. A boss who repeats the deadline 17 times has already lost authority. The deadline was important, or it wasn't. Every extra sentence is an admission of weakness dressed as emphasis. What makes this ancient lever so sharp now is that we live in a world choking on words. Everyone broadcasts, explains, justifies, sells without breath. So when someone speaks once and then stops, you listen harder than you listen to anyone else. The person who talks least becomes the one you can't ignore. Confidence doesn't shout. It sets the terms and walks away. Next time you feel the urge to defend yourself or re-explain, try the opposite. Say it, then stop. Let them chew on the silence. Never outshine the master. You know that feeling when you solve a problem your boss has been wrestling with for weeks, and instead of celebrating, the room goes cold? That's the moment you stepped over an invisible line. The ancient rule wasn't just about survival in courts and palaces, it's wired into human status hierarchies so deep that we barely notice it anymore. Your boss, your mentor, your partner, they need to feel like the one who knows, who leads, who matters most. Not because they're fragile, but because how people see themselves in relation to you directly controls whether they help you or hurt you. When you upstage someone who's supposed to be above you, you trigger something older than reason, a threat response. They'll rationalize it as you being cocky, ungrateful, or too ambitious. But what's actually happening is you've disrupted the story they tell themselves about their own importance. The thing nobody tells you is that resentment travels faster than gratitude and it sticks around longer. You could get credit for the idea in the moment, or you could get safety, continued access, and the quiet knowledge that you're indispensable. Here's where the old game gets clever. Make them look good, let them take the win, and your stock rises anyway because you become the person they trust, the one who makes them feel capable and seen. Sounds backwards until you realize that the people who actually move forward are the ones who understand this move. Let the master outshine you in public. That's not weakness. That's the fastest path to being the one no one wants to cross. Strategic incompetence. Your partner asks you how to work the washing machine for the 5th time this month. The intern keeps coming back about the spreadsheet system. They're not actually confused. They're playing a game that's older than civilization itself. Strategic incompetence is when you deliberately stay bad at something so someone else has to keep doing it for you. Plato wrote about slaves pretending not to understand their master's orders. Medieval servants feigned stupidity to avoid harder jobs. The Romans had a name for it. It works because incompetence is invisible armor. Nobody can blame you for failing at what you never claimed to know. But here's where the ancient trick crumbles in modern life. You teach people to stop asking. Your partner gets tired of explaining, so they stop inviting you to help with anything. Your boss notices you can't learn systems, so you never get promoted, never get trusted with real work. You've protected yourself from the task, but you've also trapped yourself in a smaller box. The person doing the work grows resentful, not at your incompetence, but at your choice to be incompetent around them specifically. That's when the invisible becomes insulting. The ancient version worked because power was crude and hierarchical. Now it operates through silence and accumulated small betrayals. You avoid a job and nobody talks about it, so the resentment just hardens into the walls between you. If you're leaning on this move, notice what it costs you. The people closest to you see straight through it, and they're counting whether you're worth the extra load they're carrying. Feign weakness to invite attack. There's an old military maxim that sounds backwards. Show your enemy you're vulnerable, and they'll rush toward you faster than if you stood there locked and loaded. The logic is ice cold. A person convinced they have the upper hand stops calculating. They stop being careful. They move predictably, almost hungrily, and that's when you've already moved 3 steps ahead. This doesn't stay on the battlefield. Watch it play out in a negotiation, a conflict with someone, or even social hierarchy at work. If you project total confidence and control, the sharp people around you stay sharp. They probe, they hedge, they keep their distance. But if you let a small crack show, a tiny admission of struggle, a moment where you seem overwhelmed or outmatched, something shifts. People relax. they lean in. They start sharing their real moves, their real concerns, their real leverage. You learn more in 5 minutes of apparent vulnerability than you would in 5 hours of posturing. The ancient strategists understood that weakness is information. It's bait. It's permission for others to reveal themselves. The trick is that your feigned weakness has to be just believable enough to be swallowed, but rooted in something true. A real mistake, a real struggle, a real gap. Total theater reads as theater. But honest struggle, mixed with just enough visible friction, draws predators out of the trees. They commit to the hunt because they smell blood they think is real. Once they're visible, once they've made their move, you're no longer operating blind. You're watching them move, and now you know exactly where the teeth are. Feigned madness as armor. There's a scene in almost every court drama. The jester cracks a joke that cuts the king, and nobody can touch him because he's just being foolish. That's not accidental. It's a centuries-old survival hack. Pretend you're too scattered, too odd, too unpredictable to be a real threat, and people lower their guard around you. You become harmless in their eyes, which means they stop watching, they start talking, they forget you're listening. The ancient Greeks called it playing the fool. Medieval courts made it an art form. What's wild is how little has changed. Think about the colleague everyone dismisses as a bit much or kind of weird. They often see things before anyone else and can say things that would cost a normal person their job. The eccentricity is coverage. The perceived instability is camouflage. It's why Socrates acted confused before asking devastating questions, why comedians can say dangerous truths, why conspiracy theorists hide actual observations under layers of noise. Here's where it gets tricky. Feigning madness only works if people actually believe you're safer than you are. The moment they suspect strategy underneath the chaos, the whole thing collapses and you become threatening instead. And if you play the role long enough, something darker happens. You stop knowing where the performance ends. You start actually losing the thread. The armor fuses with your skin. You become what you pretended to be. The real power isn't in being wild. It's in being unpredictable enough that people's defenses get sloppy, but you have to know you're doing it. The second you forget it's a choice, you've handed the jester's mask to someone else entirely. Kneel to raise your status. Watch what happens in a room when someone admits they don't know something. Most people tense. They smell a gap, a vulnerability. But not always. Sometimes that confession does the opposite. It makes people lean in. The Romans knew why. A general would kneel before the Senate not to surrender authority, but to prove he had enough to spare. Strength that screams is fragile. Real authority can afford to bend. So when you're in a negotiation, a pitch, a moment where you're tempted to armor up and defend every choice like it's your last stand, notice who actually wins trust. It's the person who laughs at themselves first, who says, "I was wrong about that," who asks a real question instead of performing an answer. They're not weak. They're kneeling strategically, and it works because vulnerability reads as honesty in a world drowning in performance. Most people get it backwards and broadcast insecurity while trying to hide it. The double down, the defensive crouch, the need to be right about everything. But when you're genuinely unafraid of looking foolish or being questioned, you become harder to dismiss. You're not performing strength, you're resting in it. Think back to the last person who made you trust them fast. Odds are they didn't do it with credentials or a polished pitch. They did it by being real when being fake would have been safer. That's the ancient lesson in modern clothes. Status isn't currency bought with rightness. It's built by being so secure that you can afford to be human. In a landscape of constant peacocking, the person who can actually kneel reads as someone with nothing left to prove. To David's shepherd disguise. David showed up to meet King Saul pretending to be nobody, just a kid with a harp, offering to play music when the king's mind got dark. What Saul didn't know was that this shepherd boy was already skilled enough to kill a lion and a bear with his bare hands. David had real power, but he arrived small. He didn't announce his strength or demand respect. He offered a service. He made himself useful first, and because Saul saw only a servant, not a threat, David got close enough to the throne that no rival could touch him for years. The lesson is sharp. The person in the room who feels most threatened by you is the one controlling the door. So if you actually need to move through that door, let them think you're smaller than you are, not forever, just long enough to understand the room, build trust, build allies, build proof. David didn't stay disguised forever. He eventually became king himself, but he didn't try to take the crown by announcing his credentials. He let his competence speak quietly while his humility opened doors. In your own life, watch how many people sabotage themselves by leading with their resume, their wins, their credentials. They walk in announcing their power, and suddenly everyone gets defensive. Meanwhile, the person who shows up useful, interested, and willing to do small things first, that person becomes indispensable. That person gets trusted. Disguise isn't about being fake. It's about being strategically humble. It's knowing when the room isn't ready for your full self yet, and having the patience to let it become ready. Diogenes' shameless leverage. Diogenes the cynic lived in a barrel, owned nothing, and weaponized his own shamelessness so thoroughly that when Alexander the Great, the most powerful man alive, stood before him asking what he could gift him, Diogenes simply said, "Get out of my light." No flattery, no gratitude, no performance. He had removed every hook that power could use to grab hold. You think leverage comes from money or status, but it actually comes from someone else's hunger for those things. The moment you stop needing what they can take away, they lose their grip. A person desperate for approval bends. A person desperate for a job accepts humiliation. A person desperate for love ignores every red flag waving in their face. But someone who has already decided what they will and won't do becomes strangely difficult to move. Wanting things is human and fine. The trick is wanting them without needing them. So when you walk away, you're negotiating from actual strength instead of panic. Shame works as a control device because it makes you care what others think more than what you think. Diogenes walked naked through Athens, lived on scraps, and somehow ended up more respected than every politician holding power. The real move is knowing the razor-thin difference between what you want and what you need, and guarding that line like it matters. Start here. Notice one thing you pretend to want because someone else does, or because you think you should. Quietly ask yourself if you'd actually choose it with no one watching. That small honesty is where your real power wakes up. The gift that obligates. An old friend sends you a link to a job opening. You didn't ask. They didn't have to. 3 days later, you feel it. Not quite gratitude, but a small weight. A sense that you owe them something now. That feeling didn't happen by accident. Ancient societies understood this mechanism so completely they built entire power networks on it. Hand someone a gift, and you have quietly shifted the ground between you. The recipient carries a small debt afterward, unnamed but real. This works because our brains are built for reciprocity. We hate sitting in someone's favor. We feel the imbalance like a physical tilt, and our bodies work to level it back out. Politicians, wealthy patrons, and sharp people have run this play forever. A meal, a connection, a single advantage, and suddenly the other person is more likely to say yes to your next ask. They might not even know why they're saying yes. The brilliance lies in how gifts disguise themselves as free. No contract, no force, no visible strings. But underneath, a transaction has begun, and the giver is quietly ahead. You see it everywhere now. The free trial that makes you feel obligated to buy, the favor from a boss that makes you work harder without being asked, the small kindness that pulls your loyalty before you catch it happening. Start noticing when obligation arrives after someone helps you. That feeling is real. It's not weakness or ingratitude. It's ancient code, still running underneath your skin, still making you move. The moment you name it, you get a choice. The unfinished favor. You help someone move, lend them money, make an introduction, and something shifts. They're warmer now, more attentive, easier to be around. But here's what the ancient Romans understood cold. The favor works best when it's not quite finished. The moment you declare it done or ask for repayment, the spell breaks. Unfinished debt doesn't sit dormant. It creates a tiny knot in the other person's mind. They owe you. They think about you. They look for chances to close the loop. It's not guilt exactly, though that lives nearby. It's more like an itch. We are wired to balance social ledgers, and an unresolved favor keeps you lodged in someone's head in a way a thank you card never will. Modern politics, sales, and relationships all run on this engine. A politician who helps you but leaves it vague that more is coming, you'll show up for them. A boss who writes a glowing reference for now or hints at future opportunities, you'll work harder. Someone who does you a solid without keeping score, you'll find yourself wanting to return it, to finish what they started. The sticky part is knowing which side you're on. Are you the one who did the favor and is letting it breathe, or are you the one who's been gently indebted? Both positions have weight. If you want loyalty without extracting it, leave one thread untied. If you're on the receiving end and something feels off about someone's kindness, check whether they're playing the long game. The best favors are often the ones nobody declares finished, the ones that live in that space between gratitude and obligation. Ask for water before wine. The Romans had a dinner ritual most of us never think about. Before wine touched the table, servants would ask if you wanted water, not because they were temperate, they drank like people trying to forget something, but because they'd cracked a truth about persuasion we're still learning. A parched throat agrees to almost anything. A hydrated one asks questions. Think about the last time someone pitched you something massive when you were starving, wrecked from sleep deprivation, or stuck in a sweltering room. Your defenses were offline. Your brain was rationing resources like a drought-stricken region. The ask landed differently than it would have if you'd eaten, rested, been yourself. This isn't weakness. It's pure biology. The ancients weaponized this without shame. A diplomat would arrive depleted, overwhelmed by ceremony and travel, throat dry. By the time wine appeared, his body was already primed to say yes. Fast forward to now. Before you make any big decision, ask for the water version first. If someone's pitching you something, a job, a partnership, a commitment, and you're running on fumes, pause, hydrate, eat real food, sleep. Let your prefrontal cortex return. The pitch will still be there, but you won't be negotiating from survival mode. And if you're the one asking, pay attention to the state people are in when they say yes. Are they sharp or defaulting, choosing or just tired enough to stop fighting? The Romans knew power isn't always about forcing compliance. Sometimes it's about timing the ask for when someone's actually able to think. Refuse the first offer always. The first number on the table is never really a number. It's a test disguised as a proposal, and it works because you're wired to feel relief the moment someone budges. Whether you're negotiating salary, buying a used car, or haggling at a market in Istanbul, that opening bid is designed to anchor you low while giving the other person room to pretend they're being generous when they move up. You feel grateful at the concession, but what actually happened is they just shifted the goalpost after already planting it exactly where they wanted. Here's the part most people gloss over. Refusing the first offer isn't rude, and it doesn't make you ungrateful or difficult. It's pure information gathering. When you say no and hold the silence, you learn what they actually have in their pocket, what they're really willing to pay, really willing to give. That uncomfortable quiet after your refusal is where real negotiation lives, because they either move significantly or they accidentally reveal that number was closer to their bottom line than they wanted you to know. Your gut will scream at you to accept quickly because rejection feels dangerous, because you don't want to seem pushy or impossible, because what if they walk? That fear is exactly the machinery they're counting on. But move through it anyway. Ask for what you actually want and let them sit with that ask. If they counter, you're finally in the real conversation, not the script they rehearsed before you arrived. The ancient merchants understood this. Every person who ever closed a deal worth remembering understood it too. The first offer is their opening move, never your ceiling. Refuse it, stay calm, and watch what shifts. Anchoring with an absurd demand. There's a reason car salespeople ask for the moon first. They know something your brain won't admit. The first number you hear becomes the invisible floor for everything that follows. A used Honda gets a wild ask. 20 grand. You balk. They drop it to 15. Suddenly, 15 feels reasonable, even generous, because your mind is still comparing it to that opening anchor, not to reality. You just got negotiated downward from a fantasy, and somehow you feel like you won. The ancient practice wasn't subtle about this. When a king demanded a vassal's entire harvest and the vassal offered half, both sides felt they'd won something. The absurdity of the first ask wasn't a mistake. It was the architecture. Your brain doesn't calculate value in a vacuum. It calculates relative to what came first. A favor seems small when it follows a ridiculous request. A price seems fair when it follows an insane one. A boundary feels generous when it follows an extreme counteroffer. The trap runs deeper than one negotiation. You feel like you're choosing when really you're anchored to someone else's opening move. That first wild number, that impossible story, that extreme counteroffer, it all drags your sense of reasonable downward without you noticing. Watch what happens next time someone opens with something absurd. Instead of reacting with a counter, pause and ask yourself what the real baseline should be, independent of their anchor. What would this be worth if you'd never heard that first number? That question is how you stop being negotiated by an invisible weight someone else dropped first, the three-tier price. Plato walked into an ancient marketplace and watched merchants sell identical wine in 3 vessels. Cheap clay, medium bronze, fancy marble, each price doubling with the upgrade. He saw what they were really selling, not wine, but a story about who you are. Your brain does something strange when you see 3 options instead of 2. The moment that premium tier appears, gleaming and slightly ridiculous, the middle one stops feeling like compromise and starts feeling like wisdom. You didn't want it until you saw it could have been worse or could have been more, and suddenly it becomes the safe play, the smart choice, the version of you that's sensible. This isn't new. It's anchoring wrapped in architecture, and it works on you exactly as it worked on ancient Athenians. Coffee shops, gyms, SaaS companies all use the same trick because your mind doesn't evaluate things alone. It evaluates them against what's standing next to them. Strip away the middle and the premium feels unjustified. Add a luxury tier and the standard feels like restraint. The deeper trap is how rational you feel while it's happening. You're comparing features, weighing value, playing the careful shopper, but you're actually being steered by the scaffold itself, nudged into an emotional position before your logic even wakes up. Your brain is choosing an identity relative to the other two, not choosing a price. The next time you see 3 tiers anywhere, pause before clicking, not to judge the company, but to ask yourself, which version of me are they trying to activate? That one question is enough to break the spell. The insulted merchant walk away. Watch an ancient bazaar long enough and you see the same moment repeat. A merchant's face hardens at an insultingly low offer. He rises without a word, turns away from the table entirely. No tantrum, no performance, just genuine rejection. Within heartbeats, the customer is trailing behind him, voice climbing, throwing money at his back. The lesson the merchant understood and the buyer learned in real time is that willingness to leave is currency worth more than any argument made while sitting down. This cuts straight through modern life. Salary negotiations, breakup conversations, friendship boundaries, business deals. The other person isn't scoring your words. They're reading your commitment level, your willingness to be done. Stay planted, keep talking, keep justifying, keep hoping, and they feel your desperation like a scent. Your need becomes their only tool. The moment you demonstrate you'd genuinely rather walk than accept their terms, something shifts. Suddenly, they're the one anxious about losing you. You move from supplicant to option holder. The power lives not in the physical act of leaving, but in the bone-deep readiness that makes you leave with different posture. This is why faking it collapses. People sense the bluff like heat. But when you've actually done the work to be okay with losing the deal, the job, the relationship, when other paths exist and feel real to you, that calm certainty radiates outward without effort. The merchant didn't speechify. He stood, and his absence spoke louder than anything words could build. Next time you catch yourself over-explaining, pause and ask whether you're actually ready to walk or just performing it. The slow no. There's a Roman technique for dismissal that never involved a sharp word or a door slam, just a steady, almost bored decline that wore people down through sheer repetition. Someone asks, you say not now. They ask again next week. You say not now. Month passes. Same person, same request, same gentle refusal. Eventually, they stop asking because the energy of pursuing you exhausts them more than moving on does. The slow no works because it doesn't trigger the fight response that a direct rejection does. When you say an absolute no, people hear a wall and push harder against it. When you say not now, or not this way, or maybe later, their brain keeps the door slightly open and they keep knocking. But if you never ever open it, if you are boringly, consistently unavailable, they eventually accept the reality without ever getting the satisfaction of a clean refusal. Modern life gives you 1,000 chances to use this. The boss who keeps asking you to take on side projects, the friend who keeps inviting you to things that drain you, the relative who keeps suggesting what you should do with your life. A direct no creates conflict. A slow no is just your life, grinding along, indifferent to their request. You're not mean about it. You're not angry, you're just persistently elsewhere. The power lives in the consistency, not the volume. And the strange thing is, people often come to respect the slow no more than they respect the angry one, because it feels less like rejection and more like acceptance that you simply belong to yourself. Delay as a weapon. You know the feeling? Someone goes quiet on you, doesn't text back, sits on your request for a week, and suddenly you're the one spiraling. The Romans mastered this without ever naming it. When a senator wanted to kill a proposal, he didn't rage against it. He simply asked for more time to deliberate, then asked again, then suggested the discussion wait until next month. No drama, no confrontation, just time draining away until the momentum evaporated and the crowd's attention drifted elsewhere. The Romans understood that the weapon isn't the delay itself, but what delay does to your nervous system. Uncertainty keeps you activated, burning fuel on imagined conversations, checking for updates, feeling the invisible tilt in power. If I can keep you waiting while I stay calm, I've already taken something from you. This is why a text sent at midnight lands differently than one sent at noon, why silence matters more than a direct rejection, why "I'll get back to you" can collapse a negotiation faster than a clear no ever could. The trap works both ways. When you're the one waiting, you leak power visibly. Your need becomes readable. Your impatience shows. So the ancients grasped what modern people still miss. In any dynamic where you need something, learn to inhabit your own waiting without flinching. Respond slowly. Sit with the blank screen. Let silence exist. The person who rushes to fill it is always the weaker player. Not cruelty, just how attention and control move through human space. Next time you feel that urge to reply instantly or patch a quiet moment, pause instead and watch what actually shifts. Fabius, the delayer's patience. Hannibal was coming, and Rome was terrified. The great general had already crushed 2 Roman armies, and the whole city was screaming for immediate revenge, for bold and brilliant tactics that would end him fast. So they sent Fabius Maximus to the field, and he did nothing. He waited. He shadowed Hannibal's army, refused to fight, burned supplies instead, let time do the work. Rome hated him. They called him a coward, a delayer, whispered that he was prolonging the war because he liked power. But Hannibal's army was getting thinner. His supplies dwindled. His men grew tired of occupying foreign land with no decisive battle. Eventually, Hannibal retreated. Rome won not because they fought brilliantly, but because one general understood that not every situation rewards speed. Some situations reward patience, and the person who can sit with public disapproval long enough to let reality work in their favor wins harder than the person who rushes to prove they're brave. You see this now in negotiations, in relationships, in career moves, where everyone around you is pushing for the fast answer, the quick win, the dramatic gesture. The person who can tolerate being called slow, indecisive, or afraid while they actually let time, information, and circumstance consolidate in their favor, that person shapes outcomes. The real trap is mistaking silence for surrender, waiting for weakness. Fabius knew the difference. The hardest power move is the one that looks like you're doing nothing at all, and the rarest strength is knowing when to hold still while everything around you demands motion. Most people never learn this lesson because the cost of learning it feels too high. Retreat that pulls them forward. Think of the last time someone gave you space after you'd done something wrong. Not silence as punishment, but actual room to think, to feel small, to miss them a little, that moment when they stepped back instead of charging in, that's when you actually wanted to move toward them. The ancient strategists knew something backward about human nature. When your enemy retreats, you chase. When someone you care about withdraws, you follow. We're creatures of pursuit, and scarcity makes things magnetic. If you're always available, always explaining, always trying to convince, you fade into background noise. But if you vanish for a week, not theatrically, just genuinely occupied with your own life, suddenly your presence becomes something people notice. Relationships, negotiations, even plain attention follow this pattern. A parent who steps back and lets their kid fail teaches more than one who hovers. A person who stops fighting for someone else's approval often gets it anyway. The psychological pull runs deep. We chase what moves away. We solve the puzzle of distance. We work to prove we matter to those who seem less certain. The power isn't in being cold or withholding. It's in having enough self-respect to stop bidding for scraps. It's in knowing your own value clearly enough that you don't hunger for constant reassurance. When you move backward without bitterness, you don't repel. You become interesting again. You become the thing people lean into rather than the thing they're obligated to tolerate. Next time you're pushing too hard, pull back just once. That space is where the shift happens. Burn your own boats. Hernan Cortés landed in Mexico with his men in 1519, and the first thing he did was order the ships burned. No escape route, no way home if things went sideways. Either they conquered or they died trying, and that choice, that irreversible choice, changed what they believed they could do. The mind works backward from your options. If you keep a lifeboat ready, part of you is already halfway into it. You negotiate with yourself before you even fight. But when the boats are ash, your whole nervous system rewires. Suddenly, you're not managing risk. You're solving for only one outcome. Watch how this lands in your own life. You say you want to quit your job and start a business, but you keep the job for security. You want to write a novel, but you don't tell anyone, because if it fails, nobody has to know. You want to change how you live, but you keep one foot in the old way, just in case. That safety net is actually a parachute that never opens. It just keeps you falling slower. The ancient wisdom isn't really about recklessness. It's about how human commitment works. When there's no retreat, you stop rationing your intelligence and courage. You deploy everything. You become dangerous to your own excuses. This doesn't mean burning literal boats or making a dramatic one-way bet tomorrow. It means identifying one area where you're half committed and asking yourself honestly, what would change if I actually closed that door? Then do it small. Make it real. Let yourself find out what you're capable of when running away stops being an option. Cut off your own retreat aloud. There's a moment right before you do something hard when your brain starts listing escape routes. You could quit. You could postpone. You could tell people you tried and it didn't work out. Those exits feel like mercy, but they're actually anchors. They keep part of you from fully committing. The ancient generals knew this. Before a battle, they'd burn the ships behind them or announce to their troops that there was no retreat, no backup plan. Brutal? Yes, but it forced everyone to stop hedging and start fighting. You can use this today, and it works best when you say it out loud to another person, not a vague promise like, I'm really going to do this. Be specific and public. I'm launching my project on the 15th, and I've told 3 people who will call me out if I bail. Or, I'm ending this relationship and I'm moving out next week. The moment your words hit the air and someone else's ears, your brain registers it differently. You've crossed a line. Your nervous system knows you meant it. Suddenly, the option of quitting becomes socially real, not just a whisper in your head. This doesn't remove fear. It removes the false comfort of a hidden escape hatch. And that discomfort is exactly what forces you to problem solve instead of retreat. The trick is making your statement specific enough to be binding, but aimed at someone who won't let you off easy. That's when the ancient lesson hits hardest. When you cut off your own retreat aloud, you finally learn what you're actually capable of. Public vow as self-binding. You tell your friend you're hitting the gym tomorrow morning, and suddenly backing out feels harder, not because of judgment, but because the promise now lives outside your head where it can't be quietly forgotten. The Romans understood this centuries ago. When you speak commitment aloud, something neurological shifts. Your brain treats public words differently than private intention, converting them into something real in ways a silent resolution never becomes. Humans are identity creatures, wired to protect how they see themselves. And you don't want to be the person who breaks their word in front of others. That threat to integrity cuts deeper than any external consequence. That social witness, even if they never mention the promise again, creates what psychologists call commitment and consistency bias. You become invested in proving that the version of you who made that vow is authentic. The ancients didn't rely on willpower or secret motivation tricks. They engineered accountability directly into the ritual itself. A public vow makes you responsible not just to someone else, but to your own mirror, and your brain starts filtering information to match. You notice gym opportunities. You rationalize why staying home contradicts who you said you are. You literally become the person you claimed to be. Here's what makes it dangerous and brilliant. This mechanism doesn't require anyone's judgment at all. They could forget entirely. But you won't, because every time you think about that promise, your mirror neurons replay the moment you said it aloud, reinforcing the loop. Want to change something about yourself? Stop whisper planning it alone. Say it where ears exist. Your pride will do the work your willpower cannot. The witnessed handshake. Walk into almost any deal room and you'll still see it. Two people shake hands while others watch. The grip itself is almost meaningless. Maybe 2 seconds, a pump, done. But the witnesses, that's where the real work happens. Romans understood this so well, they built entire ceremonies around it. A promise made in private is just a preference. A promise made in front of people is a debt, and your reputation depends on it now. The ancient world was brutally small. Word traveled fast, shame stuck hard, and everyone eventually sat in the same room again. So when someone agreed to something in front of witnesses, they weren't just keeping their word to the other person, they were keeping it to themselves as a public identity. That pressure was a lock. Now, jump to today. You negotiate by email, shake hands on Zoom, send a Slack message saying yes. Nobody's standing there watching in person, so it feels easier to change your mind, renegotiate, disappear without consequence. But here's what the ancients knew that we're forgetting. Witnesses don't have to be physically present to count. Tell someone what you promised. Write it down where others can see it. Make your word visible to the people around you. The moment you do, something shifts underneath. You're not breaking an agreement between two people anymore. You're breaking a public claim about who you are, about the kind of person you've decided to be. That's the real contract. The handshake was never about hands. It was always about making invisible promises visible enough that you couldn't pretend they didn't exist. Sacred oath escalation. Think about the last promise you made to yourself and broke: a gym resolution, a diet shift, a commitment to call someone weekly. You felt lighter when you abandoned it, right? Not because you actually wanted to fail, but because the promise was abstract, just you and your brain having a conversation you could edit anytime. Now imagine making that same promise in front of 10 people you respect, or signing it, or posting it online. Something shifts. The promise moves from internal whisper to public law. Ancient cultures understood this completely. Oaths sworn in temples, witnessed by elders, invoked the gods themselves, not because gods were listening, but because everyone else was. When you vocalize a commitment publicly, your brain treats it differently. You are no longer just failing yourself. You are failing an audience. Shame and reputation lock in. You become defensively invested in proving the oath was real. This is why cults, religions, and high-control groups have always demanded public declarations, baptisms, vows, testimonies. Once you say something out loud in front of witnesses, backing away feels like admitting you were lying, weak, manipulative. Your ego hardens around it. The modern version is everywhere. People announcing diets online, posting gym selfies, declaring productivity systems to followers. The oath escalation means they follow through not from genuine change, but from image protection. The mechanism is ancient and it still works, which is why understanding it matters. If you want to actually change something, stay deliberately quiet about it until the behavior is automatic. Let the foundation set before you invite the witnesses in. Salt as a unit of trust. Roman soldiers were sometimes paid in salt instead of coins. That's where salary comes from. But salt wasn't just valuable for preserving meat or seasoning food. It was valuable because it was verifiable. You could look at it and know exactly what you had. No hidden weight, no dilution, no surprise. When you handed someone salt, you were handing them something you could both agree on, something that couldn't be argued about later. Now think about your own life. How much of your stress comes from relationships where you're never quite sure what you actually have? A partner who says they care, but whose actions contradict it. A boss who promises flexibility, then punishes you for using it. A friend who's always about to show up. The agreement feels solid until it doesn't, and suddenly you're arguing about what was promised, what was really meant. The ancient lesson isn't about salt itself. It's that trust isn't built on big gestures or nice words or declarations. It's built on small, repeatable, verifiable actions. When someone does what they said across time, in the tiny ways, they become like salt to you. You know what you're holding. You can count on it. There's no ambiguity. Most people spend energy trying to convince others they're trustworthy through explanation and justification. The real currency is consistency in small promises, showing up on time, texting back, doing the unglamorous work nobody notices. That's your salt. That's what people can actually measure, and it's what builds trust that lasts. The shared meal contract. Imagine someone you barely trust invites you to dinner and you show up. Halfway through, something shifts. Not because they suddenly became trustworthy, but because you are now eating together. In ancient times, sharing a meal was a binding ritual. Enemies could become temporary allies over bread. Strangers became neighbors the moment food touched a common table. The meal was a contract written in salt and wheat, not paper. Your body recognized it even if your mind didn't understand why. Today, we've forgotten the power of this, but it hasn't lost its grip on us. When you eat with someone, your nervous system softens. You mirror their breathing, their pace, their mood. Oxytocin flows, defensiveness drops. A difficult conversation over coffee feels safer than the same words in an email. Your brain treats shared food as a signal. This person is part of my tribe now, if only for an hour. This is why business deals close over lunch. Why apologies land harder when there's a meal involved. Why a parent and teenager fighting can find sudden common ground at the dinner table. The food isn't magic, it's biology hijacking your skepticism. You can use this. If you need to negotiate something real with someone, suggest a meal, not a meeting. If a relationship has gone cold, cook together, not to manipulate, but to remind both your bodies what trust actually feels like when it's woven into the ordinary act of sitting down and eating side by side. The ancients knew what neuroscience is only now confirming. Breaking bread together remains the fastest way to break down walls. Eat what they eat. Walk into any room and notice who holds real power. It's rarely the loudest voice. It's the person eating what everyone else is eating. Sounds like nothing until you realize you're watching ancient social code fire in real time. Breaking bread together has always been how humans signal trust, belonging, and submission to the group. When you eat what they eat, your body speaks before your mouth does. You're saying, I share your world. I'm not above this. I'm safe. This is why business deals happen over lunch, not in sterile conference rooms. Why diplomats share meals before peace talks. Why joining a new friend group feels safer once you've ordered what they order at their favorite place. You stop being the outsider the moment you touch the same food. Something in your nervous system relaxes when mirroring reaches the gut level. The modern trap is thinking you're too smart or different to need this. You show up to the team dinner and order something completely separate, dietary rules, taste preferences, whatever. Not wrong exactly, but you've created a small, invisible distance. The group eats together. You eat alone at the same table. Ancient rulers grasped this so deeply, they had food tasters, not just to check for poison, but because eating the same meal first meant absolute loyalty, true membership in the circle. Notice how it works backward too. How quickly someone feels excluded when they can't eat what the group eats. Belonging and nourishment became the same act thousands of years ago, and your body still feels that way. Find what they're eating. Eat it with them. Watch what opens. The wine cup order of pouring. There's an old Roman trick that still works at dinner tables, boardrooms, and first dates. Pour the wine for everyone else before you pour your own. Sounds backward, doesn't it? But here's what happens. The moment you serve others first, something shifts in how they perceive you. You're no longer just another person at the table. You become the host, the one in control, the one worth listening to. Your glass gets filled last, which means you're also the one who appears least concerned with your own comfort. That reads as confidence. That reads as authority. The ancient court strategists knew this. If you're thirsty, drinking first signals anxiety. You need something to steady yourself. But if you pour for the merchant, the client, the rival before yourself, you're broadcasting that you're so secure in your position that your own needs come after theirs. People trust people who seem comfortable enough to wait. They follow people who serve first and serve themselves last. The trick still works because human psychology hasn't changed. We still read small gestures as character. We still associate generosity with power, not weakness. Next time you're in a negotiation or trying to shift the dynamic in a conversation, watch the order of your gestures. Who do you attend to first? Who do you leave for last? The person who pours themselves first often leaves the room thinking they won. The person who pours everyone else first often leaves with the deal. Small moves, ancient logic, same human mirror reflecting back what it sees. Pay attention to who serves first. Guest host inviolability. The Romans had a word for it, hospitium, a bond so sacred that even enemies could share bread without fear. Walk into someone's home and you were untouchable. The host owed you protection. The guest owed the host respect. Breach it, and the gods themselves would punish you. Sounds ancient? Your nervous system is still wired that way. Think about the last time someone invited you over or you invited someone in. There's an invisible force field around that moment. A coworker you usually keep at arm's length suddenly feels safer to talk to. A neighbor becomes someone you help without calculating the return. The stakes shift. Inside that boundary, you're more vulnerable, yes, but also more trusting. And people sense that you're both playing by an older, deeper rule that predates your conscious mind. Here's where it gets sharp. This is why exclusivity feels like honor. Why being invited to a private dinner hits different than a public event. Why having access to someone's home, their time, their space, without cameras, without witnesses, changes the whole dynamic. You've been made a guest. The host has made themselves accountable to you in a way they won't with a stranger on the street. The trap is thinking this only works in your favor. When you're the host, you've also signed an invisible contract. You're responsible. You can't be casual with someone's safety, comfort, or secrets once they've crossed your threshold. Bad hosts leave such a mark. They broke something ancient, not just etiquette, trust itself. Purification before the ask. The ancients understood something we've mostly forgotten. You don't walk into a king's chamber reeking of yesterday's failure and expect a gift. They called it purification, and it wasn't just spiritual theater, it was psychological genius. Before asking for anything that mattered, you had to show up different, cleaner, intentional. The ritual itself rewired you. You couldn't fake it halfway through. When you light a candle or take a cold shower or sit silent for 10 minutes before a difficult conversation, your brain shifts. You're not the person who was just scrolling, just angry, just desperate. You're someone who prepared, and people feel that. They trust it. They respond to it. Here's the modern trap. We skip the preparation and lead with the need. You text your ex at midnight instead of sleeping first. You ask your boss for something while you're still frustrated. You pitch an idea while you're spinning, and every single time you're surprised when it lands badly. The ask isn't the problem. The asker is. The ancients knew that if you wanted to influence someone, you had to influence yourself first. That little ritual, that tiny separation between wanting something and asking for it, it's not superstition. It's the difference between showing up as a person drowning and showing up as someone who chose to be there. Next time you need something real, try this. Pause before you reach out. Do something deliberate. Doesn't matter what. The point isn't the action. It's that you took control of your state before you asked for anything else. That shift alone changes everything. The threshold pause. Ancient temples had a design feature most people never noticed. A small step at the entrance, sometimes almost invisible. You had to shift your weight, break stride, look down. Architects called it the threshold, that forced moment between outside and inside. It wasn't an accident. They understood something about human psychology that we've somehow forgotten. Crossing a boundary without pause makes you careless. You carry whatever mood, urgency, or distraction was chasing you straight through the door. Watch yourself walk into a meeting when you're angry or into a conversation while still scrolling your phone. You don't arrive, you collide. The threshold pause works because it interrupts momentum. It gives your nervous system a chance to actually land somewhere instead of just barreling forward on fumes. The Romans built this into ritual. Medieval monasteries did too. Even your grandmother probably had some version. She'd sit on the porch for a moment before coming inside, or pause at the front door and take one breath. Not because she had time to waste, but because she understood that rushing through transitions is how you lose control. Try it this week. Before you walk into your house after work, stop on the step. Before a difficult phone call, set the phone down for 10 seconds first. Before you answer someone who just upset you, take one actual breath. That tiny suspended moment isn't lost time. It's the space where you get yourself back. It's the difference between reacting and choosing. The threshold pause is old, but it still works because we are still the same creatures, just moving faster. Sit where the door is. Your ancestors didn't choose the chair with their back to the wall because they enjoyed the view. They chose it because the other option meant getting killed. That ancient calculus hasn't left your body. Even now, surrounded by spreadsheets and Slack messages, your nervous system still reads the room for where danger could slip in. Sit facing the exit and something shifts immediately. Your amygdala stops its low hum, your shoulders drop. You actually hear what the person across from you is saying instead of half listening while your hindbrain catalogs every sound behind you. Flip it and face the wall, and you're running on background alert whether you notice or not. That subtle tension in your neck, the way your attention splinters, the energy you're burning on threats that don't exist anymore. Watch it happen in real restaurants. The confident people find the seat where they can see the room. The anxious ones back into the corner. It's not a choice they're making consciously. It's their bodies telling them where to feel safe. The person who controls the sight lines isn't working harder, they're working lighter. They project more. They listen deeper. They're not leaking presence on invisible enemies. This week, test it yourself. Move your seat. The physical shift is small, but the reset is real. Your breath will slow, your focus will sharpen, and you'll suddenly remember what it felt like to be fully in a conversation instead of standing guard. Your ancestors knew something we keep forgetting. Before you speak, before you think, you first decide where to sit. Stand still while they move. You're in a conversation and someone's voice gets sharp. Their body leans forward, their hand gestures quicken. The impulse hits you like a reflex. Match their energy, raise your own voice, move faster, and that's exactly the moment you lose. The person who stays rooted while chaos spins around them becomes the calmest point in the room, and calm is currency. Think of water in a storm. It doesn't fight the current. It stays low and lets the noise pass overhead. When you keep your body still, your breath even, your voice steady while someone else is burning through their composure, something shifts in the dynamic. They're spending energy, you're conserving it. They're reactive, you're not. Historically, the most dangerous people in power were rarely the loudest. They were the ones who didn't need to prove anything through movement or volume. They stood while others scrambled. A recruiter trying to pressure you into an answer gets less traction if you just wait in silence instead of fidgeting or talking to fill the gap. A family member escalating an argument loses steam faster when you don't mirror their panic. The trick is making stillness feel intentional, not frozen. Shoulders relaxed, eyes present, breath grounded, not defiant, not dismissive, just unmoved. This creates a subtle gravitational pull. Agitated people often slow down around someone who refuses to accelerate with them. Your nervous system notices the difference too. When you resist the urge to match their tempo, you keep yourself out of their fear spiral. Try it next time. Don't move until you've chosen to. Mirror the ritual, not the words. Watch a person in a room full of strangers. Really watch them. They won't remember the speech. They will remember whether the speaker's hands were open or closed, whether they moved toward them or away, whether they stood still or paced. Ritual beats rhetoric every single time, and the ancients knew this so well, they built civilizations on it. A handshake, a bow, a moment of silence. These gestures do neurological work that speeches can't touch. Your mirror neurons fire when you see someone move with intention, and suddenly you're feeling what they feel without knowing why. This is why a parent holding a child still matters more than reassuring words. Why sitting together in prayer carries weight that talking about prayer never will. Here's the trap. People can perform the ritual without the feeling, and you'll still absorb it anyway. A fake smile still activates your smile response. A rehearsed nod still makes you believe you're being heard. Politicians and cult leaders and manipulators understand ritual so perfectly because they know you're not thinking about the words. You're responding to the shape of how they're said. The real power was never the chant. It was the gathering, the repetition, the bodies in the same space doing the same thing until it becomes who you are. So ask yourself right now, what rituals are you actually absorbing? Not the words, but the physical actions, the patterns, the unspoken permission structures you're beginning to mirror just by being near them. Repeat their word back. You're in a tense conversation and someone just unloaded something heavy on you. Your instinct is to jump in, defend, explain, or solve it. But there's an older move, much older, that works like a reset button. You simply hand their words back to them, a beat slower and slightly softer. So you felt like nobody was listening. That's it. No agreement, no argument, no advice yet. The ancient rhetoricians knew something we forgot. The person who feels heard stops fighting and starts thinking. When you mirror their language back, something neurological happens. Their nervous system reads it as recognition, not attack. The defensive wall lowers a notch. They often correct you, not just nobody, but you specifically, and suddenly they're clarifying their own position instead of barricading behind it. Politicians, therapists, negotiators all use this trick because it's not a trick at all. It's the rarest currency in modern life, genuine reflection. The catch is timing. Too fast and it feels like mockery. Too much of it and it becomes obvious you're running a script. The art is in the pause. Let a sliver of silence live between their words and yours. Then repeat just the emotional kernel, not the whole complaint. You're not parroting them back like a bored parrot. You're saying, I actually caught what you meant. Try it next time someone is upset with you. Don't solve, don't defend, don't even fully agree. Just give back what you heard and watch what happens when someone finally feels like they've been seen instead of dismissed. That shift from fighting to thinking is where everything else becomes possible. The name as a hook. A Roman commander knew something we've mostly forgotten. Say someone's name and their whole nervous system shifts, not metaphorically, neurologically. When you hear your own name spoken aloud, your brain floods with attention the way it does when you smell smoke. That's why ancient orators would open speeches by naming the people they wanted to persuade, not as an afterthought, but as the first lever. They were literally waking up the room. Watch what happens the next time someone uses your name in conversation. Your shoulders might drop. You lean in. Suddenly, they have permission to ask for something bigger. Suddenly, you care more. The name is a toggle switch between casual listening and full presence. You politicians still do this. Salespeople too. They know that a generic you all has maybe 30% of a room's actual attention, but Jennifer or Marcus has 90. It sounds like intimacy even in a crowd. It sounds like you matter specifically, not as a demographic or a data point, and your brain believes it. The trick here isn't manipulative, it's just honest. When you call someone by their actual name in a conversation, you are saying, I see you, I know who you are not interchangeable. That signal travels faster than any argument. So the next time you need someone to really hear you, whether it's a partner, a colleague, or a room full of people, start by saying their name, not as stage dressing, as proof that you're talking to them, not at them. Watch how much faster things move. It's the smallest lever that works every single time. Concede the trivial point. 3 minutes into a disagreement about whether you said something last week or 2 weeks ago, your brain locks in. The date doesn't matter anymore. What matters is that you picked a side, and admitting wrong feels like surrendering the whole argument. This is the trap ancient negotiators learned to sidestep, and it still catches modern humans every time. When someone corrects you on a small detail, the restaurant name, the exact wording when something happened, your instinct screams defend. Don't. Agree instead. Say, you're right, it was Tuesday, not Wednesday. Watch the shift, their body softens, the fight drains out of them. They just won something small, which means you stop fighting to protect your dignity over a detail that never mattered in the first place. This is strategic vulnerability, not weakness. By conceding the trivial point, you actually seize control. You stay calm while they get to feel correct. Their guard comes down. When the real disagreement surfaces, the one that actually matters, you have all your credibility and presence intact because you weren't scrambling to defend a date or a word choice. People remember who stayed reasonable far longer than they remember who was technically right about everything. The ancient move was about knowing which battles to lose so you could win the ones that counted. Your relationship, your reputation, your influence, those are what's genuinely at stake, never the footnote. The person who can afford to be wrong about small things comes across as someone who knows what actually matters. And that kind of person wins the conversations that count. Name the objection first. There's a moment in every negotiation or difficult conversation where you can feel it coming. The unspoken but hanging in the air like smoke. Your partner's jaw tightens. Your boss goes quiet. Someone shifts in their seat. That's the objection, still invisible, still dangerous because it's unnamed. The ancient rhetoricians knew something we've forgotten. If you say the thing your listener is already thinking before they have to say it, you flip the entire dynamic. You stop being defensive and start being honest. You become the person in control of the story. It sounds backwards. Why volunteer your own weakness? But the reason is surgical. When you name the objection first, your listener's brain stops grinding. They're no longer waiting for you to finally admit what they already see. Instead, they're watching someone brave enough to look at the problem straight on. That shifts them from adversary to ally in a single breath. Try it next time. Before they object, say it yourself. You're probably thinking this is too expensive. I know this sounds risky. You might wonder if I'm just telling you what you want to hear. The tension breaks. The conversation becomes real. The other person relaxes because you've named the elephant instead of pretending it's furniture. People are far more likely to trust someone who acknowledges the hard thing than someone who pretends it doesn't exist. It's not manipulation. It's actually the opposite. You're inviting them into the truth instead of forcing them to fight their way there, and that permission to be honest changes everything about how they listen to what comes next. Steel men before you strike. That moment right before you send the email with teeth in it or walk into the room with your whole argument already coiled, the ancients knew something we keep forgetting. Build your opponent's best case first. Not the weak thing they actually said, not the straw man that falls over if you sneeze on it, but what a genuinely sharp person could argue from that position. Then hit that version. It feels like you're handing them loaded weapons, but here's what skipping it costs. You defeat a ghost. You demolish something they never claimed. You feel sharp afterwards, and they leave more certain than before because you swung at an empty chair. The steelman flips the whole game. When you can say their position back so clearly, they'd nod and say, "Yes, exactly that." Something cracks open. You stop being opponents in a match and become two people staring at the same thing. And what happens next is quiet. You build their argument and sometimes realize they caught something you didn't. Your own thinking tightens. Your position becomes genuinely yours now, not just defensive flinching. That heat before a hard conversation is your signal. Instead of sharpening your blade, ask what would actually land with a thoughtful version of them. Say that part back first. Watch the shoulders drop. Watch the person in front of you stop bracing. The air changes. Suddenly, you're not performing. You're actually thinking together. That's when real conversation becomes possible. Write the enemy's speech first. Sit down before the conversation happens and write the argument your opponent would make if they were brilliant and honest. Not the straw man you shadowbox in your head at 3 a.m. The real one. The version where they're not stupid or malicious, where they actually have a point you haven't fully reckoned with. Ancient rhetoricians discovered this works because it rewires something in your brain before you ever open your mouth. When you articulate someone else's case well enough to almost convince yourself, the defensive crouch drops away. You stop performing certainty and start actually thinking. When you finally speak, you're not reacting anymore. You're responding from a place of real knowledge. You've already felt the weak spots in your own argument. You know which concessions you can make without your whole position collapsing. You know which parts of their concern actually matter and which ones don't. This doesn't weaken you in a conversation. It makes you formidable. The person across from you can feel the difference between someone reciting a script and someone who's genuinely thought. They relax, they listen, and here's the subtle part. Sometimes writing their speech first means you realize they were half right or more. Maybe your plan needs adjusting. Maybe you need them on your side more than you need to win the round. The people who actually change minds aren't the ones shouting loudest. They're the ones who understood the other side well enough to know exactly which words would land. Before your next real disagreement, try this once. Write their case like you mean it. You'll walk in different. Socratic humility as ambush. You've seen it happen. Someone asks you a question that sounds innocent, almost deferential, and before you know it, you're defending a position you half believed 5 minutes ago. That's Socratic humility working as a weapon. Socrates didn't pretend to be confused because he was actually lost. He did it because asking the right question makes people build their own cage. When you say, "I don't know, but I'm curious what you think," you're not being weak. You're clearing the room of defensiveness. The other person gets to feel smart, to explain, to elaborate, and in that explaining, inconsistencies crack open. Contradictions show themselves. You don't have to argue. You just have to ask the next small question. The trap is so elegant because it feels like kindness. The person speaking feels heard, respected even, right up until they realize they've talked themselves into a corner they built with their own logic. Modern salespeople, therapists, and manipulators use this all the time. They ask you gentle questions that sound like they're learning from you, when really they're mapping the weak points in your thinking. The armor we put up against lectures dissolves when someone seems genuinely curious about our view. You stop defending and start explaining. An explanation is where contradictions live. The real power isn't in weaponizing this against others, though people do. It's recognizing when someone is using it on you. The question that feels too simple, the listener who nods too much, the pause that stretches just long enough before the follow-up. Those are the tells. Stay awake to curious questions dressed up as respect, because the gentlest probe often cuts deepest. The one question interrogation. A detective doesn't announce you're lying. They ask, "Where were you that night?" A seasoned negotiator skips the pitch and goes straight to, "What would it take for this to work for both of us?" Salespeople and generals learned centuries ago that the person holding the question owns the room. You walk in ready to persuade, defend, explain, and instead someone delivers one clean question and your own brain betrays you by rushing to fill the silence. Your mouth starts moving. You justify. You reveal priorities you didn't even know you had, doubts you were hiding from yourself. The ancient interrogators grasped what most of us forgot. Asking feels collaborative, while demanding feels like pressure. Someone asking you seems genuinely curious, almost vulnerable in their curiosity. Your defenses lower. You want to answer, and in answering, you spill things you planned to keep locked, not because you're weak, but because a question created a space where honesty felt safer than silence. The trap is that most people never learned to wait. We panic and fill the gap with nervous laughter, reassurance, more words, anything to stop the discomfort. But the waiting is where the real architecture lives. If you actually want to know what someone thinks, what they need, or where their real resistance hides, stop rehearsing your case. Ask one tight question and then do something nearly extinct in conversation. Sit with the quiet long enough for them to genuinely think. That uncomfortable pause is where the truth moves. You'll learn more in those few seconds than an hour of talking could ever give you. Answer the question behind the question. Your partner asks if you're mad. The literal answer is no, but they're not really asking about your mood, are they? They're asking if the relationship is still safe. A colleague emails asking whether the project budget is realistic. They're not hunting for spreadsheet logic. They're asking if you believe in them. Your kid asks what time dinner is. What they mean is, will you be there? The layers underneath our words are where actual communication lives, and most conversations fail because we answer the surface question while the real one sits unanswered, growing teeth. Ancient people knew this instinctively. A king asking a messenger, "How far is the capital?" wasn't asking for mileage. He was asking, "Will we make it by nightfall?" A healer asking, "Where does it hurt?" wasn't mapping pain. They were asking, "Are you ready to change?" The skill is learning to listen down past the script. When someone asks you something, pause for one breath and ask yourself, what fear, hope, or need is actually driving this? Sometimes it's simple, fatigue, doubt, loneliness. Sometimes it's wrapped so tight you almost miss it. The dangerous move is answering only what you hear. That's how partnerships wither, how teams stop trusting, how small misunderstandings become chasms you cannot cross. The real shift happens when you slow down, sense what lies beneath the words, and answer both the question and what's driving it. You're asking if I'm mad. I'm not. And I care that you're worried. That lands different. That's where actual safety begins and where people finally believe you're truly listening. Let them discover it themselves. You've probably had the experience of telling someone a truth they weren't ready to hear and watching them dismiss it instantly. Then, 6 months later, they come to you excited about this idea they just realized, and it's the exact thing you said before. What changed? Not the idea, them. The ancient power here is that people don't believe what you tell them. They believe what they discover. When you hand someone an answer, you've robbed them of the work that makes it real. But when you ask the right question or leave a gap they can't help but fill, something locks in their chest. They own it. They'll defend it. They'll act on it. This is why the best teachers rarely lecture. They ask. They pause. They let confusion sit there like an itch. A parent who tells their kid, "Don't touch the hot stove," gets compliance maybe, but a kid who reaches, feels the heat, and pulls back, that's knowledge written into their nervous system now. The trap most of us fall into is mistaking clarity for persuasion. You think if you just explain it better, louder, with more evidence, they'll finally get it. But you're working against human nature. We are creatures who only truly believe what we've earned through small moments of friction and discovery. Next time you're tempted to dump your wisdom on someone, pause and ask yourself, what question could I ask instead? What small piece could I leave unsaid that would make them want to figure it out? That's the old power. That's still how minds actually change. The deliberate small confession. You're halfway through a meeting when you realize you've built your whole argument on a detail that's actually wrong. You could let it breathe, slide past it, pretend it never landed. But what if you stopped instead and said it plainly, "Actually, I was wrong about that part"? Watch what happens. The tension doesn't explode. It dissolves. People don't suddenly doubt you. They lean closer. There's something almost alchemical about a small, public admission that does the opposite of what shame promises. The Romans knew this intimately. Leaders who never admitted error became the tyrants people plotted against in whispers, but those willing to say, "I misspoke," or "that didn't work," built movements that held through betrayal and loss. A confession disarms you because it whispers something without words. I'm not afraid of you knowing I'm flawed, which means I'm probably not lying to you about the rest. This isn't about dumping every insecurity on the table or confessing the thing you're meant to keep hidden. Timing and specificity matter wildly. One small truth told early, a miscalculation you caught, a detail you got backwards, a misread of the room, becomes a foundation that holds when the real weight comes down. The trick is feeling this in your bones. Admitting a small mistake doesn't weaken your position. It's the only thing that actually cements it. Trust isn't built in grand gestures of perfection. It lives in the moment when someone says, "I was wrong," before anyone else has to point it out, and everyone in the room knows they heard something rare. Reputation before argument. You walk into a meeting. One person has spent 3 years showing up, keeping promises, admitting when they're wrong. Another person shows up today with the best logical argument you've ever heard. Who wins the room? Not the logic. The track record does. This is ancient. The Romans called it ethos, and they understood that before anyone believes your words, they believe who you are. Your reputation is the permission slip for your argument. When you have built trust over time, people grant you the benefit of the doubt. They listen harder. They assume good intent. They give you room to be unclear because they know you're not trying to manipulate them. but walk in without that account built up, and even a flawless argument bounces off like rain on stone. People are checking you, not your case. They're asking silently, has this person proven they care about truth more than winning? Have they admitted mistakes? Do they speak differently behind closed doors? These questions settle before your first substantive point. The modern trap is thinking you can skip the reputation part. You'll just be so logical, so right, so undeniable that it won't matter. It does matter every time. Your credibility is earned in 1,000 small moments, keeping a minor promise, acknowledging nuance when you didn't have to, not taking credit that isn't yours. That's the real work. The argument is almost secondary. So if you find yourself losing every disagreement despite being right, the problem might not be your logic at all. It might be the foundation nobody's standing on yet. Let rumor arrive before you. Ancient courtiers and military strategists understood a move we've mostly forgotten. Send your reputation into a room before your body arrives. Not lies, just the story people tell about you. A general known for mercy would watch cities open their gates without a siege. A merchant with a name for fair dealing would close deals faster because trust was already there. The shadow you cast walks ahead, and that shadow either opens doors or locks them shut. Think about the last time someone introduced you by saying what they'd heard. You weren't walking into that conversation as a blank slate. You were walking in as a story already alive in their mind. They were nervous or excited or dismissive before you opened your mouth. The ancient strategists didn't control that story through deception. They controlled it by making sure their visible actions were interesting enough that people couldn't help but talk. How you treat the waiter, whether you keep a small promise, how you handle being wrong. These moments feel neutral, but they're seeds. The person who arrives with a reputation for showing up doesn't have to reprove it every time. The work's already done. The person who arrives unknown can spend months trying to undo the damage of one thoughtless moment. So the real play isn't image management or careful words. It's making your choices visible enough that the truth about you spreads faster than any story you could spin. Let your actions write the rumor, then just show up and watch what doors move. The controlled leak. You're sitting in a meeting and someone you don't trust is present. There's a rumor you want to spread, but saying it yourself would look desperate or unreliable. So you lean over to someone you know talks, whisper it like a secret, like you're uncomfortable sharing but feel they should know. Within hours, it's everywhere. And here's the brilliant part. It traveled on someone else's voice, so you have plausible deniability. This is the controlled leak, and empires have run on it since Caesar's time. The mechanism is simple. You release information in a way that looks accidental or reluctant, always through a messenger you know will repeat it. It feels like gossip, which makes people trust it more than a formal announcement. Gossip feels real because it's supposedly not meant to reach you. The power sits in the separation between source and spread. You get the benefit of the narrative without the cost of ownership. Politics does this constantly. A campaign plants a story with a journalist. The journalist breaks it, and suddenly it's news, not spin. Companies leak product details before launches to build buzz without committing. People do it in relationships too, telling one friend something in confidence they know will circle back to the person it concerns. The defense isn't complicated but requires vigilance. Watch who knows what and assume that if you tell someone something that benefits you to spread, it probably will. Before you lean in and whisper, ask, would I be comfortable if this came back to me with my name attached? If the answer is no, don't leak it at all. The oracle's vague verdict. You walk into a tarot reader's booth, hand over cash, and hear, "I see a crossroads. Change is coming. Trust your instincts." And you leave thinking they've cracked your life open. Here's what actually happened. They said something so broad that your brain did all the work. You filled in the blanks. Your anxieties, your hopes, your half-formed plans all rushed in to complete the picture. That's not prophecy. That's you recognizing yourself in a mirror made of fog. The oracle's real power was never the words. It was your desperate need to believe someone understood what comes next. Ancient seers knew this cold. Vagueness is a feature, not a bug. The king will fall in battle could mean the enemy king, your king, a rival, a symbolic death of power. And no matter what happens, you'll find the match and call it proven. Modern versions are everywhere. A manager tells you, "We're looking for someone with more initiative," and your brain torches itself trying to decode what you did wrong. A text says, "We need to talk," and suddenly you're running 17 disaster scenarios. The vagueness hijacks your attention because your mind abhors a vacuum. It will make up stories to fill the space. The move here is surprisingly simple. When someone gives you a prediction, prophecy, or critique wrapped in fog, resist the urge to scramble. Ask for the specific. What exactly do you mean by initiative? Or what specifically do you want to discuss? You'll either get clarity or watch the oracle's power evaporate entirely. Most vague verdicts collapse under direct light. Prophecy as permission slip. Ancient oracles didn't predict the future so much as they licensed behavior. A king heard the gods would grant him victory, and suddenly every choice looked inevitable. The army marched harder, the allies fell in line. The courage came easier because destiny was already written. The oracle didn't make the prophecy true, it made the king act like it was. You've seen this exact pattern in modern life, just with different names. A doctor tells you stress causes your symptoms, and suddenly the headaches feel more real, the fatigue more justified, the permission to quit more legitimate. A therapist mentions anxious attachment, and you begin narrating your relationships through that lens. Every text feels like proof, every silence a confirmation. A career coach says your industry is disrupted, and you either feel trapped or aggressively entrepreneurial, depending on which story you swallow. The real engine here isn't accuracy. It's that once you believe it, you start acting like it's true, which actually makes it come true. You soften or harden, you hold on or let go, you reach or retreat. The prophecy becomes a permission slip for the version of yourself that was always waiting for an excuse to emerge. What makes it dangerous is that it works so well, which is exactly why the trap stays invisible. You search for proof the prophecy was right and find it everywhere because your new behavior generates new evidence to match. The ancient trick didn't require magic or divine sight. It just required someone tell you a story about yourself that felt important enough to change how you move through the world, and your own life would do the rest. Omens engineered on purpose. A Roman general wanted his troops to attack at dawn, but morale was flagging. Soldiers were spooked, muttering about bad signs. So he stationed a trusted aide in the temple, waiting. When the general and his army arrived to check the auspices, the aide released a white bird from inside the sacred space. Perfect timing, perfect symbolism. The troops saw the omen as confirmation from the gods and charged forward with renewed conviction. Nothing changed except what they believed. This wasn't crude manipulation. It was sophisticated architecture of certainty, and it worked because humans don't just follow facts. We follow signals that feel heavy with meaning. You do this constantly without noticing. You wear a power suit to a meeting because the ritual of dressing shapes how you feel, which shapes how others perceive you. You check your horoscope before a big decision, not because the stars move, but because the framing of what the universe wants soothes the weight of choice. A text from someone you've been thinking about arrives right as they cross your mind. Pure coincidence, but it feels chosen. Your brain hungers for omens, for evidence that you're on a path, that something larger is organizing your life. The most successful people understand this hunger and use it deliberately, whether through daily rituals, lucky objects, or carefully timed announcements that feel like validation from outside themselves. If you want to move people toward action, engineer moments that feel significant. Not through lies, through deliberate selection of real events. A win, a sign, a small proof that the direction matters. Your people will feel the omen and walk through fire. Lots to remove blame. The Romans had a practice called sortition, drawing lots to distribute public duties, not because they were lazy, but because they understood something we've forgotten. When you have to serve, you can't blame the system that chose you. You own it. That psychological trick still works today, except we've reversed it. We're drowning in choice, which means we're drowning in someone to blame. Your boss didn't make you take that job, you chose it. The algorithm didn't force you to scroll, you reached for your phone. The culture didn't make you angry, you decided what to care about. None of that blame is wrong exactly, but it's incomplete. Here's where it gets sticky. The more you blame external forces, the less you feel agency, and the less agency you feel, the more you blame. It becomes a flywheel spinning faster. The ancient move was different. By introducing an element of chance, the lots, they made one thing crystal clear. You're in this together, and you're responsible regardless of how you got here. Modern, you don't need to draw lots. You need to notice where you're looking for escape hatches instead of handles. What would it feel like to fully own one decision you're currently resenting, not pretending the circumstances don't matter, just releasing the idea that they absolve you? That shift from "this happened to me" to "I'm here now" doesn't fix anything outwardly, but it returns your power. And people who feel powerful stop being trapped in their own stories. The God decided, not me. Walk into an ancient temple and you'll find the same relief carved over and over: a king presenting tribute, a warrior laying down his sword, a merchant releasing a debt. The caption reads something like, "The God willed it," or "Divine will prevailed." It sounds like a cop-out until you realize what ancients were actually doing. They were stepping sideways out of blame. If the God decided, then you didn't fail. You didn't choose wrong. You weren't weak or foolish. The outcome was never in your hands. Today we have no gods, so we invented psychology instead. We blame our childhood, our neuroticism, our circumstances, our bad luck, our timing. The mechanism is identical. We're still moving the locus of control outside ourselves. But here's what ancients knew that we forgot. By saying the God decided, they actually freed themselves to act. No crushing weight of personal responsibility. No shame spiraling. They could grieve, adapt, and move forward. Meanwhile, we modern people strip away the God language and wonder why we're paralyzed by guilt, replaying conversations at 3 a.m. trapped in what-ifs. We own every outcome so completely that failure becomes identity, a permanent stain. The ancient move wasn't about dodging responsibility at all. It was about dosing your accountability so you don't drown in it. You can own your choices without owning the whole world. The next time you catch yourself saying, "I should have," try this. I did what I could with what I knew. Not a cop-out, a realistic boundary. That's where the ancient power actually lives. Borrowed authority of the dead. You walk into a therapist's office and see Freud on the wall. You read a business book with Darwin on the cover. You hear someone say, "as Socrates said," and suddenly their argument feels weightier, doesn't it? That weight is borrowed. You are not actually responding to Freud or Darwin or Socrates. You are responding to the ghost of their credibility, to centuries of people agreeing they mattered. The dead cannot argue back. They cannot be wrong about modern problems. They cannot tell you that you misunderstood them. This makes them perfect vessels for whatever authority you need to lend your own position. A manipulator quotes an ancient sage to make a half-truth sound eternal. A therapist invokes Jungian theory to make their hunches feel scientific. A parent says, "This is how your grandmother did it," as if time testing proves wisdom. The real trick is simpler than you'd think. You cannot fact-check the dead in real time. You cannot call Aristotle and ask him what he really meant. So his words become clay. They take the shape of whoever is using them. The Romans knew this. They invoked their ancestors to win arguments and elections. We do it now too, just with different names and book covers and TED Talks. The move is identical. When someone borrows dead authority to settle a live question, something has shifted in the conversation. The burden of proof just walked out of the room. Notice that shift. Ask yourself, is this person engaging with now or hiding behind then? The answer usually tells you everything you need to know. The impossible standard of the ancestors. Your great-grandfather built a house by hand and fed a family on a single income. Your grandmother raised 4 kids without asking for help. Somewhere in your lineage, someone walked miles for water, survived without electricity, endured a war. And now you exist in a world where you can order dinner from your phone, yet you still feel like you're not doing enough. That gap between their legendary resilience and your ordinary Tuesday is where shame gets born. The ancestors become the measuring stick that was never meant to measure you. Here's what slips past us. Their lives were stripped down to survival. No social media, no infinite choice, no algorithm telling them they should be more. Your great-grandmother wasn't optimizing her morning routine between 2 jobs while raising kids and running a side business. She was alive. She did what the day demanded. The trap is inheriting their narrative without inheriting their constraints. You're comparing your behind the scenes, the overwhelm, the competing demands, the 1,000 small choices to their highlight reel frozen in family legend. The old story says they were tougher, therefore you are soft. The truer story is simpler. They faced different problems. You're not weak because you struggle with modern complexity. You're human, asked to be human in conditions they never imagined. When that voice shows up saying, your ancestors manage better, get curious instead of ashamed. What were they actually not managing? Then ask, what am I actually managing that they never had to? That question shifts you from inherited failure back into your own actual life. Cato's repeated closing line. For nearly 3 decades, Cato the Elder stood in the Roman Senate and said the same thing. Carthage must be destroyed, not whispered, not softened, not varied for effect. He just kept saying it, hammering the same nail at the close of every speech, every meeting, every chance he got. And it worked. Carthage fell. Not because one brilliant argument swept the room, but because one man refused to let anyone forget what mattered most. There's a lesson buried in that relentless repetition that modern persuasion, loaded with flash and novelty, keeps missing. We've been taught that repetition is lazy, that people tune out the second time they hear something. But what Cato understood and what neuroscience now confirms is that human brains don't form real conviction from a single exposure. They form it through rhythm, through return, through hearing the same essential truth looped back to them until it becomes the background hum of how you think. Your boss knows this. Marketing knows this. Every algorithm pushing your feed knows it too. They repeat, they loop, they return. The difference is whether the repetition serves you or someone else's agenda. Next time you want to persuade someone who matters, your kid, your partner, your team, resist the impulse to craft one perfect argument. Make it a steady signal instead. Say the core of it again and again, not annoyingly, but thoughtfully, with real conviction underneath. The person who sounds like a broken record doesn't lose power. They gain it. Consistency reads as certainty, and certainty moves people far more than eloquence ever will. That's the real magic Cato found, the empty chair at the table. There's a reason ancient families left a seat open during meals, not for ghosts, but for the person they were pretending wasn't there. The empty chair was honest in a way words never are. It acknowledged that absence shapes a room exactly as much as presence does, and that pretending someone isn't there is often more painful than naming them outright. Think about the last time you were in a group and someone's name came up. The ex, the relative nobody talks about, the friend who did the unforgivable thing. Notice how the conversation gets thin and careful. You're all performing around the hole they left behind. That's the modern empty chair, and it costs you everything that could have been said if you just admitted it out loud. The ancient lesson cuts deeper than it seems. What you don't name controls the room. The unspoken weight of the absent person becomes heavier than their actual presence ever would have been. They occupy more space by being missing. So here's what shifts when you break the pattern. Name the absence. Say it. We're all thinking about her right now, aren't we? Or, this is weird without him here. You're not inviting them back or forgiving anything. You're just stopping the pretend. The room suddenly becomes real again. Energy returns. Conversation finds its actual shape instead of tiptoeing around an invisible obstacle. The ancient power wasn't about hospitality or mysticism. It was recognition that denial is a form of control, and control always costs more than honesty does. One honest word does what months of silence never could. The parable as safe attack. A parent wants to tell their teenager they're being selfish. They could say it straight and watch the conversation collapse into defensiveness and slammed doors. Instead, they tell a story. A friend's kid got everything they wanted and ended up with no friends. The teenager nods along, feels nothing personal, and 3 weeks later makes a different choice. The parable slipped past the guards. Ancient teachers understood this bone deep. Jesus didn't argue with the Pharisees about pride. He told them about a farmer sowing seeds, a rich man who couldn't fit through a needle's eye. The Buddha didn't lecture about attachment. He described a monk clinging to a burning house. Stories bypass the part of your brain that says, "This is about me and I don't like it." You're simply listening to what happened to someone else. At least, that's what your ego thinks. But the image lodges deeper than any direct criticism ever could. Your defenses stay down because the story never pointed at you by name. Here's the lever that still works after 2,000 years. The listener thinks they came up with the lesson themselves. They felt it in the story, drew their own conclusion, and now they own it completely. That's why a parable echoes across centuries while a sermon gets forgotten by Tuesday morning. If you want to shift how someone thinks without triggering a fight, stop trying to convince them with logic. Give them a character, a choice, an outcome. Let them recognize themselves in the reflection, not the mirror. Aesop's animal proxy critique. Imagine you're in a room where saying your boss is a coward could get you fired, but saying the fox was too scared to cross the bridge might make everyone laugh and nod. Aesop figured out something lethal. Animals let you name the truth without naming the person. You can talk about greed, stupidity, cruelty, laziness, all the things that would get you exiled or worse, by hanging them on a tortoise, a crow, a scorpion. The fable becomes a mirror that people choose to look into. Your uncle suddenly recognizes himself in the ant who works all summer while others play. Or your colleague sees the pride of the rooster who wouldn't listen to warnings. The genius is that nobody has to admit you meant them. They can laugh, feel the sting, and walk away believing they got the lesson about nature instead of about themselves. Modern life is stuffed with this same trick. We share memes about toxic people instead of naming someone specific. We write posts about how people act when we mean one person. We deploy stories about relationships or work to critique someone without confrontation. The animal becomes permission to speak hard truths in soft rooms. But here's the catch. Sometimes distance saves the message from landing entirely. Someone can dismiss Aesop's crow as just a story about birds. They can scroll past your cautionary tale without ever flinching. The proxy works because it lets people run. Next time you're tempted to hide critique in a story, ask whether you're being kind or just afraid to say what you mean. The fool who tells the truth. A court jester from centuries back says the thing nobody else will say, and the king laughs instead of executing him. The safety comes not from the truth itself. Plenty of honest people get destroyed for honesty, but from how it arrives, wrapped. A jester is licensed to be ridiculous, permitted to be wrong, and when the dangerous truth wears bells and nonsense, it slips past the defenses that would normally slam shut. You've seen this work without naming it. The friend who texts something brutal disguised as a joke, the comedian saying what everyone thinks but cannot say aloud, the kid who blurts what adults have typoed around for months. They sound foolish maybe, but the truth lands different when it arrives from the margins instead of the seat of power. Here's the trap. Societies collapse partly because the people with power surround themselves with those too afraid to contradict them. The real fools are the ones who know better and stay silent, watching the ship sink. The ones who actually get heard are the ones with nothing to lose, the ones willing to sound a little ridiculous to get past the walls. People build around difficult truths. If you ever need to tell someone something true they don't want to hear, forget being solemn and righteous about it. Wrap it in humor. Lead with your own mistake first, so you're not standing above them. Admit the uncertainty. Make yourself small enough that they don't have to defend against you as a threat. The truth survives when it doesn't feel like an attack, when it arrives from someone the listener can relax around. That's the ancient lesson still working now in every conversation where directness fails and a little foolishness wins. Jester license for hard news. In medieval courts, the jester was the only person allowed to tell the king he was wrong, as long as it was funny. A fool's cap and a jingling bell gave permission to speak truth that would get anyone else executed. The humor was not the point, it was the passport, and here is what still works today. People will hear hard things from you if you make them laugh first, or if you frame the difficult message as playful rather than preachy. You have probably felt this yourself. Someone tells you something that stings, but because they did it with lightness or absurdity, you actually listen instead of shutting down. Your defenses stay down. Your pride does not flare. The The jester understood that the human nervous system does not open to a lecture. It opens to laughter, to surprise, to something that feels less like an attack and more like a secret shared between friends. This is not manipulation. It is respect for how people actually process threat and fear. If you need someone to hear you on something real and difficult, try leading with the joke, the weird angle, the observation that makes them smile first. Then slip the truth in through that open door while they are still breathing easy. The opposite approach, landing hard facts with no warmth, no humor, triggers every defensive wall we have fast. Watch the jesters around you. They are not silly because they lack seriousness. They are effective because delivery determines reception, and the wrapping matters as much as the gift inside. The devil's advocate office. Medieval courts kept someone whose only job was to argue against the Pope. Corporate boards now hire consultants to poke holes in their plans before they're final. There's wisdom buried in this old architecture, and it has nothing to do with liking disagreement. Your brain absolutely hates being wrong and will find 1,000 subtle ways to hide what it doesn't want to see. Walk into a meeting convinced your idea is solid, everyone nods, and something in your chest relaxes because the approval feels like proof you were right. That warm feeling is the danger. It's the haze before you make a choice that costs you money, time, or trust. The devil's advocate, whether it's one person, a ritual, or a trusted friend, is the cold splash that wakes you up, not to prove you're wrong, but to make sure you've actually thought through what you might be missing. Your brain hired itself to defend its own decision, so it can't audit itself. Someone else has to do that job. Here's the actual move. Stop treating pushback as an obstacle and start treating it as expensive insurance you can't afford to skip. When someone says, "But what if?" they're not being difficult. They're protecting you from yourself. The Roman Republic lasted centuries partly because they built disagreement into power itself, not as noise, but as architecture. You can steal that structure for your own stakes. Before you commit to anything big, find someone willing to be uncomfortable in that office. Then listen like your future depends on it, because it does. 10th man contrarian duty. Watch any room long enough and you'll see it. Someone pitches an idea, a few heads tilt in approval, and suddenly everyone is certain. You know that moment when speaking up feels like showing up to a dinner party and announcing you hate the food, so you swallow it. But what ancient generals figured out, and what modern boardrooms keep forgetting, is that consensus without friction is just groupthink wearing expensive clothes. The 10th man rule doesn't ask for politeness. It demands that when 9 people align on something that matters, the 10th person has an obligation, not a preference, to argue the opposite, even if they're not convinced. Not because they're right, because groups need a pressure point, a voice that keeps the machinery from rusting shut. The moment everyone stops questioning is the moment everyone stops thinking. You can feel it happening. A team is about to commit to something big. Someone raises a hand with an objection and faces tighten. "We've covered this already," someone says, but that contrarian's job isn't to win. It's to force the consensus to explain itself out loud, to defend what suddenly feels obvious. In your own life, you have to be that voice sometimes, even when it costs you socially. Not to be clever or difficult, to stay conscious. And when someone else does it to you, when they poke holes in your neat plans, resist the instinct to dismiss them. They might be saving you from a choice you'll regret in 6 months. The 10th man isn't wise. They're the immune system. The 2-column judgment. You walk out of a meeting thinking your boss hated your idea, but you also remember her nodding twice and asking a follow-up question. Both things happened. So, which one is true? Your mind wants to pick a column and run with it, usually the worst one. The Stoics knew this trap intimately. They split judgment into 2 halves, what you actually observed and the story you're layering on top of it. The observing part is clean. You saw a facial expression. You heard a pause. You got an email with short replies. The story part is where you lose the plot. The pause meant disappointment. The expression meant contempt. The brevity meant they don't respect you. Here's where it gets useful. The ancient thinkers understood that the gap between column 1 and column 2 is where your entire suffering lives, not in what happened, but in which meaning you assigned to it. The brilliance is that you can sit with both columns at the same time without rushing to a verdict. You don't have to pick the optimistic story or the catastrophic one. You can say, I observed X and I'm currently telling myself Y, but Y is just one possibility. This creates space to ask for clarification, space to gather more data, space to notice your own bias before it hardens into certainty. When you feel that familiar spike of shame or rage after someone's words or actions, pause and write both columns down. That friction between observation and judgment is where your freedom actually lives. Most people never even look there. Sleep before the verdict. At midnight, you're replaying the sharp thing you said, the work call you're second-guessing, the moment you stayed silent when you should have spoken. Your brain is prosecutor and judge both, building an airtight case against you. Here's what ancient practice and modern neuroscience agree on. Exhaustion warps your ability to see yourself fairly. Sleep deprivation doesn't just fog your thinking. It hijacks your threat detection system. A small mistake becomes a character flaw. An awkward moment becomes social death. A mild disagreement becomes betrayal. You're not reasoning. You're operating in fear with your amygdala running the show. The Stoics built this into daily practice. They refused to judge themselves until morning, after sleep. They knew what your brain needs to know right now, that sleep returns your prefrontal cortex to the game, letting context and proportion flood back in. The thing you said was awkward, but it wasn't malicious. The decision was uncertain, but it wasn't reckless. Your exhausted mind strips away nuance and leaves only the worst possible red. By morning, after 7 or 8 hours, the fact separates from the fear almost on its own. The knot loosens. The perspective widens. When you catch yourself spiraling at 2 a.m., try this. Notice what's happening and promise yourself you'll think about it tomorrow. Not avoidance, actual fairness to yourself. A verdict worth keeping requires a mind that's had rest. Your exhausted brain is a terrible court. Give it 12 hours and a pillow, and you'll be surprised what disappears. Never explain a punishment twice. Watch a conversation where someone's already heard why they're in trouble, and then you say it again. Notice the shift. Eyes glaze, jaw tightens, and suddenly the real emotion isn't shame or regret. It's resentment at being lectured. Kings and generals knew this for centuries. Deliver the consequence once, clearly, then move on. The repetition stops being about understanding and becomes pure power play, and both of you feel it. When your boss explains why she's cutting your project scope and brings it up again at the next meeting, it has nothing to do with the work anymore. It's about reminding you she won. That pivot poisons everything that follows. At home, with friends, even alone. When you're already sitting with the weight of a decision, the second explanation lands like proof you're stupid rather than that you made a mistake. Ancient rulers kept it brutally simple. The punishment was the message. A fine paid, a task done, then silence, no sermon, no and another thing. That silence made it stick, not additional words circling the same point. Your teenager knows why they lost their phone. They don't need to hear it again on Friday. Your partner understands why you're stepping back. Explaining twice just broadcasts that you don't trust them to have received it the first time. The resistance feels real. You want certainty. They genuinely understand that it lands, that they'll change. But humans don't learn from your voice turning sharp a second time. They learn from consequence and the quiet space to think through what happened. State it once. Let the weight do its work. Praise in public, correct alone. You walk into a meeting and your boss says, "Great work on that report. Everyone should see it." Then later pulls you aside about the one error buried on page 6. Notice how the praise landed like sunlight and the correction like a private conversation between allies, not an ambush. That's the ancient formula that still works because it touches something deeper than logic. When you praise someone publicly, you are not just complimenting them. You are handing them status in front of their tribe. Their nervous system relaxes. They feel safe. They feel seen. But correct them in that same room and something different happens. Shame floods in, defensiveness rises, and suddenly they are protecting their reputation instead of hearing you. The correction becomes about survival, not growth. Here is where it gets sticky. Most people reverse this instinct. They correct publicly to make an example or prove a point, then offer private praise like it is a consolation prize. This tells the person their failures matter more than their wins. It also trains everyone watching to fear the room. But when you flip it, celebrate loudly, coach quietly, something shifts. The person knows their mistakes do not define them publicly. They trust you enough to actually hear feedback because it is not attached to humiliation. And everyone else learns that this place rewards contribution, not perfection. The ancient leaders who lasted understood this. People will move mountains for someone who builds them up in front of others and respects them enough to improve them in private. That trade-off, public love, private growth, is how you turn a moment into loyalty. Spare one to break the rest. Think about the last time you bought something you didn't need, a shirt, a subscription, a gadget that promised to change your life. Somewhere in your brain, a small voice whispered, "You deserve this. You've been good. One small thing won't hurt." That voice is ancient, and it knows exactly what it's doing. The Romans understood a strategy so simple it borders on sinister. Give people one small indulgence, one acceptable rule break, and they'll justify whatever comes next. Spare one drink, and suddenly 3 feel reasonable. Skip one gym session, and the week dissolves. Break one promise to yourself, and the next one feels easier. The permission structure is what matters. Once you've proven to yourself that the rule is flexible, your brain stops fighting you. It stops treating the boundary as real. What made this so dark in ancient power plays is that rulers used it deliberately. Give the people one minor luxury, cheaper grain, a holiday, a game, and they'll tolerate massive unfairness elsewhere. Feed them one story that makes them feel smart, and they'll believe the next lie faster. The genius is that it feels like generosity, like you're giving something away, but you're actually collecting permission. Every small compromise becomes a token in a jar, and eventually that jar is full enough to justify almost anything. The move isn't to be rigid about everything that breaks people. It's to choose what you actually protect. Know which lines don't bend, because the moment you convince yourself one doesn't matter, the rest start talking, and by then it's too late to remember why you ever cared. Decimate to unify. The Roman army had a brutal math for mutiny. Take 10 soldiers, line them up, execute every 10th one. The rest watched. Horrifying, yes, but also psychologically genius. The soldiers who survived weren't just scared of the punishment, they were bonded to the men beside them by shared guilt and survival. That act of witnessed cruelty actually made the legion tighter. Now, most of us don't run militaries, but the principle still lurks in how groups form. When you remove someone from a tribe, fire them, exile them, shame them publicly, the remaining people huddle closer. It's a darker current in team dynamics that nobody wants to admit out loud. A company that suddenly lays off a department doesn't just lose those people. The survivors become more aligned, more paranoid, more loyal to whoever is left. A friend group that cuts someone off doesn't evolve morally. It often becomes more insular, more sure it was right. The shared enemy, even if it was one of your own, cements the boundary. This is why scapegoating is so sticky and why it's so hard to undo once it starts. The group has tasted the unity that cruelty brings, and some part of them, not the conscious part, the older part, will crave that again. Watch the moment your circle gets tighter through exclusion rather than inclusion, when someone becomes the thing you all agree to fear or dislike together. Real unity doesn't need a body on the floor to hold its shape, and if you're building something that does, you're not building trust, you're building dependence on terror. That difference matters more than you think. Honor the defeated general. Every power struggle arrives at the same fork. Crush the loser into nothing, or do something the ancient world knew and we've almost forgotten. Dignify them. When a defeated general laid down his weapons, a wise leader didn't erase him from history. Instead, something stranger happened. The victor gave him a seat at the table, a role in what came next, sometimes even public acknowledgement of his past victories. Sounds soft until you see what followed. The defeated general became a bridge instead of a bomb. His followers didn't need to keep fighting in the shadows. The general himself didn't become a resentful ghost plotting revenge. He became someone with skin in the new arrangement, which meant he had reasons to make it work. The psychological shift is brutal in its simplicity. A person who lost and got erased becomes an enemy forever, but a person who lost and got honored becomes someone who owes you something quieter than loyalty. They owe you the absence of their rage. You see this everywhere now. A colleague loses the project pitch. A competitor's business folds. Someone you outmaneuvered wants to stay connected. The instinct is usually to let them drift, to move on to the winner's circle alone. But when you honor the defeated, when you acknowledge the real effort, leave their dignity untouched, and give them a place in what comes next, you stop manufacturing enemies and start building people who actually become grateful, not because they're soft, but because you made it survivable to lose. That's the kind of power that doesn't need guards at the door. Amnesty as leverage. Watch what happens the moment someone says, "Forget about it," after you've messed up badly. The entire room goes quiet in a different way. The person offering forgiveness hasn't just been kind. They've handed themselves a tool. Amnesty creates debt in a way punishment never can, because when you let someone off the hook before they've fully faced the weight of what they did, you own something now. The Romans were brutally clear on this. Grant a rival clemency after a conflict, and you don't humiliate them into submission. You make them hyper aware of your mercy, your power to destroy, your choice not to. You become the bigger person, the one in control, not through force, but through restraint. In your actual life, this hums quietly everywhere. Your boss lets slide a mistake that could have sunk you. Your partner forgives a betrayal without the full reckoning. Someone cuts you off in traffic and you let them merge anyway. Each time you've created an asymmetry they feel in their nervous system. They're now aware of how easily you could punish them, how much they depend on your goodwill, how fragile their safety around you really is. That awareness is leverage, not crude blackmail or threats, but the kind that works deeper into behavior. They'll move more carefully around you next time. They'll think before they cross you. They'll remember you as someone who had the power to destroy them and chose restraint instead. The real architecture here is simple. Never name it. Never say, "Now you owe me." Let them feel it instead. The debt works strongest when it's unspoken, when it becomes a small, permanent flinch in their body whenever you're nearby. The scapegoat ritual. In the ancient temple, the priest would lay hands on a goat, whisper the sins of the entire nation into its body, then drive it into the wilderness. One animal, all the guilt, gone. What strikes you most is not the absurdity, but the relief. A whole community watching their shame walk away on four legs and feeling for a moment clean again. We still do this. We just use different goats. The coworker who becomes the office villain, the political figure we agree to despise, the ex who carries all the blame for what went wrong. The reason we reach for scapegoats so readily is neurological. Guilt is painful, and exile is easier than reckoning. Your brain will choose the goat every time if you let it. The trap deepens because scapegoating is contagious. Once one person names the villain, others pile on, and suddenly a narrative calcifies so hard that nobody remembers they invented it together. You see this at family dinners, in group chats, in boardrooms. The moment someone becomes the problem, the whole tribe relaxes. The distributed guilt becomes singular. Here is what makes it dangerous in modern life. We have no ritual closure like ancient temples did. The goat never comes back, so we just keep finding new ones. And somewhere, a person is carrying a weight that never belonged to them alone. Next time you feel the collective pull to agree on who ruined things, pause and ask, whose relief am I actually serving? That small question alone can break the spell before the next scapegoat starts running. The list of names read aloud. There's a reason ancient generals didn't just post a notice of the fallen. They gathered the troops and read every name out loud, sometimes for hours. Something happens in that moment of hearing a name spoken into air that no written list can touch. Your brain recognizes it differently. Your chest feels it. You can't skim it or look away politely. When a name becomes sound, it becomes real in a way that text keeps at a distance. Modern companies learn this too, which is why they do roll calls before layoffs or closures instead of just sending an email. The moment someone speaks your name in a room full of people, you exist in a way you didn't before. This is why politicians use constituent names in speeches, why abusers make you repeat back to them, why teachers call attendance even though they have a roster. Spoken names create presence and weight. They make people matter. The flip side works just as hard. Silence about someone, erasing their name from the narrative, makes them disappear from collective memory faster than almost anything else. In your own life, notice when you move from talking about someone to talking to them, or when a name gets dropped from conversations entirely. That shift isn't small. It's the difference between someone being part of your world and being ghost written out of it. The next time you're in a room where decisions get made about people, watch who gets their name said aloud and whose name stays abstract. That tells you everything about who has power and who's already being forgotten. Ostracism by Rittenshard. Athens invented a weapon that required no sword. Citizens wrote a name on a pottery fragment, and if enough piled up, you were exiled for 10 years. No trial, no specific crime, just collective will expressed in broken ceramic. What made it work wasn't the punishment itself. It was that written words felt official in a way whispered doubts could never be. Fast forward 23 centuries and you're holding the same tool in your pocket. A quote yanked from context, a screenshot of an old post, an allegation spread without verification. The medium changed, but the mechanism is untouched. Your name gets voted on in pieces, often without you knowing who's casting or why. The Athenians understood what we're rediscovering in real time. Written fragments stick differently than speech. A rumor dies in a conversation. A text survives in perpetuity. A face-to-face conflict has a person in it, tone and relationship softening the edges, but a screenshot arrives as pure allegation, stripped clean, easier to pass along. The genius of ancient ostracism wasn't the exile, it was the speed. One vote per citizen, and you could topple a person from trusted to untouchable in a single assembly. We digitized that process and made it frictionless. No gathering required, no accountability spread across a crowd, just millions of people, each dropping one shard, each one feeling innocent in isolation. Look down. What piles up when everyone adds just one small piece? The next time you share that fragment, pause and ask whether you'd want the same stones thrown back at you. Exile as the worst penalty. The ancient Romans understood something we're starting to remember. Banishment hurt worse than the whip. They'd rather lose a limb than lose the tribe. And if you think that's ancient history, watch what happens to someone in your own life when they get excluded from the group chat, unfollowed, or quietly removed from the inner circle. The pain is real, physical almost, because exile doesn't just separate you from people. It separates you from meaning itself. You become the version of yourself that nobody sees. The things you'd normally say go unsaid. The jokes die in your throat. You exist but don't belong, and that mismatch is where the real damage lives. Modern punishment is softer on the surface. We don't rope you to a ship and sail you away, but the mechanism is identical. Social media has made exile scalable. A single tweet can cast you out from communities that used to take months to access. And the cruelest part? You can see everyone else still inside, laughing, connecting, building. You're pressed against the glass. We're not built to survive alone. Our brains literally rewire under isolation. Our nervous system screams. So if you find yourself wielding exile as a tool, cutting someone off cold, removing them from the group, making them the unseen one, remember you're using one of history's heaviest weapons. And if you're on the receiving end, know that the pain is real, it's not weakness, and rebuilding a place where you belong is worth the fight. Divide the loyal from the loud. You've probably noticed that the person complaining loudest about a project, a relationship, or a group rarely stays when things actually break. Volume and commitment are almost never the same thing. A Roman general watched soldiers who swore fealty in front of the whole army fold in real battle, while the quiet veteran who barely spoke would take an arrow for the standard. Loudness is often camouflage for doubt. It's easier to perform loyalty in a crowd than to live it when nobody's watching and there's nothing to gain. In your own life, this splits into two types. The loud ones need the audience like oxygen. They're generous with words, quick with declarations, and they evaporate when the benefit disappears or the spotlight shifts. The loyal ones show up to help you move at midnight, remember your coffee order without you repeating it, call you out because they actually care enough to risk friction. They rarely make speeches about how much they care. They just do the thing. The trap is mistaking volume for value. A charismatic person talking constantly about friendship can feel more real than the quiet person who's been steady for 5 years. But when crisis hits, illness, failure, real loss, you'll see who actually meant it. Loyalty isn't performed on a stage. It's a small, quiet, daily choice to stay, to show up, to remember. Start noticing who makes that choice without needing an audience. Court the enemy's advisor. There's always a person in your enemy's camp who isn't your enemy at all. They're the one whispering in the decision-maker's ear. Maybe it's the CFO who quietly thinks the strategy is wrong. Maybe it's the partner who's exhausted and wants peace. Maybe it's the therapist, the assistant, the oldest friend. Sun Tzu knew something that still moves the needle. The smartest move isn't to fight the general. It's to shift the thinking of the person the general actually trusts. You court them not with flattery, but with something rarer, genuine respect for their real influence. You ask hard questions. You listen like you mean it. You show them you see what they see that nobody else does. In your own life, this means finding whoever sits closest to the person holding the gate you need to pass through, not to manipulate them, but to make them believe in the truth you're trying to share. The enemy's advisor often lands there because they're sharper than the enemy. They notice what's broken. They're already doubting in the dark. Your move isn't to get them to betray anyone. It's to make them feel witnessed. That single conversation, that moment where someone realizes you actually grasp the problem they've been carrying alone, rewires the entire system. Alliances don't flip because of threats or pressure. They flip because someone inside the room finally felt seen by someone outside it. The person closest to power is often the loneliest. They sit with doubts they can't say out loud to anyone around them. Be the one who listens first and watch the gravitational field shift beneath your feet. Marry your rival's interests. You know that person at work who grates on you, the one whose opinions feel like they're designed to oppose yours. Here's what the old strategists understood that most of us miss. Stop treating their interests as obstacles and start treating them like a map to what actually matters. When your rival cares deeply about something, it signals real power, real stakes, real human complexity hiding beneath the conflict. The ancient play was simple. Learn what drives them, not to defeat them, but to understand where their leverage comes from. A boss who seems unreasonable might be terrified of losing control. A colleague who undermines you might be protecting their territory because nobody else has. When you marry their interests to your own, you're not betraying your side. You're just seeing the full board instead of one square. This shift changes everything because it stops the fight from being abstract. You move from my idea versus theirs to what does their world require and does mine actually conflict with it? Often it doesn't. Often you were fighting over different things and never noticed. The other person becomes less of an enemy and more of someone whose priorities you now understand deeply enough to work around or even with. The quiet genius here is that people soften when they feel genuinely understood, not just when they win. They relax their guard. They stop seeing you as a threat, And from that place, cooperation happens almost without trying. It's not about forgiveness or becoming friends. It's about the practical intelligence of knowing your rival better than they know themselves. Hostage exchange of secrets. Watch what happens when two people sit down and say something they've never said aloud before, something that costs them. Suddenly, you're both exposed. Neither of you can weaponize the other's confession without risking your own getting out. This is the ancient math of vulnerability, and it still controls how humans bond. The Romans knew this. Shared secrets create mutual hostages. You cannot betray someone without burning your own reputation, your own carefully guarded self-image, right along with theirs. So people stay loyal, not because you're watching them, but because the cost of disloyalty includes their own collapse. A therapist leans in and tells you something true about themselves. Your defenses drop. A colleague admits they're terrified of failing. Suddenly, you're less alone, and you'd rather protect them than score a point. The dynamic is swift and almost automatic. We are wired to reciprocate vulnerability. But here's what's shifted now. In an age of screenshots and loose lips, the hostage effect has weakened. We can betray each other and walk away clean. So people are slower to share, more guarded, less bonded. And organizations feel this everywhere. Teams lack trust. Companies can't retain talent. Friendships stay surface level. The cost of exposure has climbed too high. If you want to rebuild genuine connection anywhere, whether at work or home, you have to resurrect the hostage exchange deliberately. Go first. Say something true that matters. Admit what you actually fear or want, not as manipulation, as real exposure, the kind that requires courage. You will be surprised how quickly the other person mirrors you back, how fast the old lever activates when someone goes first. Bread and circuses distraction. You're scrolling at midnight, outraged about a celebrity scandal, and somewhere in the background, your actual life, the conversation you've been avoiding, the project deadline, the friend who stopped calling, keeps not getting solved. That's the Roman trick. The Senate knew that when people are fed and entertained, they stop asking questions. They stop noticing that power is consolidating. They stop organizing. A full belly and a good show are sedatives disguised as gifts. What makes this ancient formula so lethal now is that nobody has to force you to look away. You do it willingly, eagerly, because the distraction feels like choice. A new scandal drops, an algorithm serves you outrage. Your nervous system gets a hit of purpose. You are fighting something. You are aware. You are engaged. Except you're engaged with a stage play while the actual theater is being renovated without your vote. The Romans had gladiators. We have infinite feeds, culture wars, and manufactured crises that smell real because they are real, just not relevant to your life. Every hour spent in that arena is an hour not spent on what actually shifts your power. Learning something, building something, knowing your neighbors, asking harder questions about who controls your attention and your time. The trap is not that outrage exists. It's that you can feel so thoroughly alive inside it. So the move is not to pretend engagement is pointless, just to notice when you're being used. Ask yourself, am I choosing this because it matters to my life or because my nervous system needed a hit? That pause is the difference between being an audience and being a citizen. Processions to manufacture size. Walk down a street in any city and count how many people it takes before you feel something shift. Before 5 becomes a crowd, becomes a movement, becomes a force you cannot ignore. Ancient leaders knew this in their bones. They did not need thousands to feel like power, only the appearance of thousands. A procession is theater with stakes, drums, robes, spacing, repetition, all designed to make your eye believe the number is larger than it is, to make your body read smallness as significance. Today, we do the exact same thing, just with different props. A protest that fills 3 blocks on the evening news looks like a nation speaking. 50 people organized in the right formation, with phones out, with chants timed right, can feel like a movement to the viewer and to themselves. Social media is basically one long procession. The retweets, the likes, the slow roll of comments making something feel bigger, heavier, more real than it actually is. You see a hashtag mentioned 4 times and assume it is everywhere. You watch a video get 15,000 views and believe it speaks for millions. A group chat of 12 people debating something can feel like the whole world is arguing. The trick works because it plays on how your attention works, not your logic. Your nervous system decides something is big and moving before your mind can fact-check it. The next time you feel swept up in something, pause and ask, am I responding to actual scale or to the feeling of scale? That one question might save you from walking somewhere you did not actually choose to go. March them past twice. Roman generals knew something we've forgotten. Repetition without exactly the same framing burns into memory differently than one loud announcement. When a crowd saw the same winning general parade through the city twice, once down the main avenue, once through the marketplace, the second viewing didn't feel redundant. It felt like confirmation, like the world itself was endorsing what they'd seen. Your brain treats the second exposure as independent evidence, not a rerun. This is why politicians hammer the same soundbite across different channels, and why the most persuasive salespeople circle back to the core idea through different doors. A pitch on Monday feels like information. The same pitch on Wednesday from a different angle feels like convergence, like multiple witnesses testifying to the same truth. You don't notice the repetition because the scenery changed. The trap is thinking you have to diversify your message to keep people engaged. You don't. You keep the core steady and walk it through different rooms, different voices, different contexts. A parent who explains a rule once and then explains it again a week later through a real situation doesn't bore the kid. They lodge it deeper. The kid thinks they discovered it themselves the second time. So, if you're trying to move someone, shift their belief, get them to act, make them remember. Resist the urge to always say something new. Take the same essential truth and march it past them a second time in a different light. That overlap is where belief calcifies, not from novelty, from pattern recognition feeling inevitable. Torches to inflate numbers. Walk into a crowded room and count the people. Now turn the lights way down and light a few torches. Suddenly, that same room feels packed, buzzing, almost dangerous with bodies. Nothing changed except visibility. Ancient emperors and kings knew this cold trick. They would stage public events at dusk or night, light massive torches and fires, and the shadows and flicker made 50 people look like 500. The human eye in low light cannot track actual numbers. It defaults to density, to movement, to the feeling of many. Fast forward to now, and the mechanism is identical, just the props are different. A social media post that shows a big red notification number, a protest photo shot from ground level with dramatic sky behind it, a conference room packed shoulder to shoulder for a photo op while the actual attendance was thin. These all work on the same ancient wiring. You cannot trust your gut sense of how many. Your brain is wired to feel magnitude through intensity, through tightness, through how threatened or excited your nervous system gets. 100 likes feel like consensus. A crowded screenshot feels like momentum. A trending hashtag feels urgent and undeniable. So when you see something that feels massive or everyone is talking about this, the trap is believing the feeling instead of the data. Pause and ask a different question. What am I actually counting here? Comments or accounts? A single moment or the full picture? The torch still works. Your only job is to flip the lights on and count the actual shadows. Drums to steal the tempo. Walk into any crowded room and you'll notice something strange. People don't move at their own pace. They move at the room's pace. A drummer in an ancient ceremony knew this. The rhythm doesn't ask permission, it just begins, and bodies follow. Heartbeats sync, breathing aligns, feet find the beat before your mind catches up. This is why armies marched in formation, why religious rituals use chanting, why a good DJ doesn't fight the crowd but sets the tempo and watches everyone drift into it. Modern life uses this exact move, only quieter and harder to spot. Your boss sets the meeting pace with their tone. A news anchor's cadence shapes how urgent you feel about a story. A podcast host's rhythm can slow your nervous system or wind it up without saying anything explicitly alarming. The trap is that you almost never notice it happening. You think you're choosing your energy level, but you borrowed it from the last person who spoke with conviction. If someone around you is panicked, their tempo hijacks yours. Not through logic, but through contagion. Your body doesn't question, it just sinks. So here's what matters. Start noticing the rhythm of the people around you. When you feel rushed or anxious, ask whether that pace is actually yours or whether you've borrowed someone else's drum. Then, if you want your tempo back, be the one who starts a slower beat, a deep breath, a pause, a steady voice. It doesn't sound like power because power usually doesn't announce itself, but it is. The uniform that erases individuals. Watch a Roman soldier suit up in armor identical to 5,000 others and notice what vanishes first, not his body, but his name. Marcus becomes Legion. A cult member steps into matching robes and the pronoun shift is instant. We replaces I and thinking alone starts to feel like betrayal. Your brain is not equipped to see individuality when your eyes report sameness everywhere. Obedience fills the space where questions used to live. Ancient generals never read a neuroscience paper, but they knew that uniforms do something deeper than signal belonging. They rewire what feels safe to think. A shared garment becomes a shared mind. You question orders less when thousands of bodies beside you wear the exact same shape. You trust your own judgment less when the mirror keeps showing you the same face, the same color, the same approved way of standing. Modern life runs on this exact mechanism, just dressed up quieter. Corporate dress codes, team jerseys, company logos that start to feel like skin. The weight of it does not announce itself until you catch yourself softening an objection, making a question polite instead of sharp, thinking the safe thought instead of the true one. Solidarity is real and necessary. Humans need to belong somewhere, but there is a gap between choosing to stand together and forgetting you ever had the choice. The next time you feel that particular warmth, that comfort of looking exactly like everyone else, pause and ask yourself something honest. Am I believing this because I actually do, or because disagreeing would mean standing visibly alone? That single question often holds enough light to keep your voice from disappearing entirely into the crowd. Shared hardship bonds strangers. Walk into an airport terminal during a weather delay and watch the transformation. 2 hours ago, these people were isolated with their phones and private worries. Now they're laughing together, sharing snacks, swapping flight stories like old friends. A stranger becomes an ally the instant you both realize you're stuck in the same problem. That shift runs deep in us, deep enough that armies have exploited it for millennia. Soldiers who've never met will die for each other after a single terrible night because shared danger literally rewrites the brain's threat map. You stop being unknown when you're both bleeding in the same mud. But here's what cuts deeper. The hardship doesn't need to be life or death. A project deadline, that's insane. A family dinner that spirals awkward, a long hospital wait. Anything that makes people feel caught in it together softens the walls faster than months of careful conversation. Timing matters, though. The bond forms while you're living it in real time, not after. Finish the ordeal and people drift back into their corners. But in the middle of it, you become someone's genuine ally. Ancient rulers grasped this instinctively. They'd throw festivals, declare wars together, build shared rituals, anything to make their people feel bonded to each other and bound to them. You can't manufacture real hardship, obviously, but you can stay awake to when it arrives naturally. When it does, that's your window to build the kind of trust that actually survives the calm. The stranger next to you might matter far more than you suspect if the moment gets real enough. Initiation cost creates loyalty. Hazing has haunted human societies for centuries, and the reason is rarely about cruelty. It's that we're wired to protect what we've suffered for. The ancient mystery cults understood this perfectly. Make entry brutal enough, and the initiate becomes an evangelist for life. Make joining frictionless, and people evaporate the moment something easier appears. You see this stripped of robes and secrecy everywhere now. People who paid 5 figures for a retreat defend that mentor fiercely. People who downloaded the same teaching for free, they forget it by Tuesday. A friend you had to earn stays closer than someone who just showed up. Your brain stamps a price tag on things that cost you something: pain, time, vulnerability, inconvenience, small sacrifice. The moment someone chooses friction, they stop being a passenger and become an owner. That shift is neurological, not rational. Free trials convert poorly. Expensive ones stick. Secrets you dug to uncover get guarded like treasure. The trap is confusing the cost itself with the value. The initiation doesn't create worth, but it creates a psychological stake that rewires how someone sees what they've joined. They stop measuring the thing against reality and start defending it against loss. This is why cults survive, why cult-adjacent wellness programs thrive, why people who've sacrificed for a belief become its most dangerous advocates. If you want loyalty, don't smooth the path. Make the entry real. Make them choose something despite resistance. Then watch how they protect it, not because it got better, but because they've already bet themselves on it being worth the cost.